There is a public access show in the early seasons of South Park called Jesus and Pals, and the host of that show is Jesus. He sits at a little desk in a little studio in a little Colorado mountain town, and he takes phone calls from strangers who want spiritual advice. It is, at first glance, a joke. It is also, quietly, the closest thing this show has ever come to a thesis on faith. Tonight, on Paper Town, we are going through all of it. The way South Park has wrestled, mocked, defended, eulogized, and quietly respected religion across more than 2 decades on the air, from the spirit of Christmas to cartoon wars and beyond. So get comfortable, turn the lights down low, and if you haven't subscribed, it really does help us keep making these. To understand how South Park treats religion, you have to start with the fact that Jesus Christ is a recurring character on the show. Not in a vision, not in a dream sequence, not as a punchline who shows up once and disappears. Jesus lives in South Park. He has an apartment. In the early seasons, he hosts that public access cable show, Jesus and Pals, where he sits with a producer and takes calls from troubled viewers the way a local late-night radio counselor might, except the host is also the Son of God. The conceit is so straightforward and so absurd at the same time that it tells you everything about the show's approach. Religion in South Park is not separated from the everyday. It is not over there in church on Sunday and not mentioned the rest of the week. It is folded into the fabric of the town, into the wallpaper, into the local TV listings, into the way characters bump into divine figures in the supermarket and the diner without ever quite registering them as a miracle. In the very first thing Trey Parker and Matt Stone ever made together as a public proof of concept, a short film often called The Spirit of Christmas, Jesus fights Santa Claus. They sail through the air. They throw punches. The boys watch. Eventually, a sort of mediator arrives, the two of them reconcile, and the message lands in a deliberately childlike rhyme about Christmas. That short, the one circulated on VHS tapes in the mid-90s, was the calling card. It was the thing that got passed around Hollywood and ended up on the desk of a network executive, and from that desk, it became a television show. And the show that emerged from it did not back away from the central joke. It doubled down. Jesus stayed in town. Santa stayed somewhere up north. The supernatural stayed embedded in the world. Through the first few seasons, Jesus is given an arc that is, in its own strange way, almost reverent to the New Testament. He is gentle. He is patient. He gets pulled into local disputes because the people of South Park, having an actual divine figure within driving distance, treat him a bit like the manager of a complaints department. They expect him to fix things on demand. They get frustrated when he does not perform a miracle to order. And the show is interested in the gap between what people want religion to do and what it actually offers them. Jesus here is forever being asked to solve problems that he is not really there to solve, and a slow current of disappointment runs through the way the townspeople treat him. It is one of the show's gentlest jokes, but it is sustained over years. In one of the very early episodes, Damien arrives in the town. He is the son of Satan sent up from hell to enroll in the local elementary school. By the end of that episode, there is a boxing match between Jesus and Satan in the center of town. It is broadcast like a heavyweight bout. There are odds and concessions and shouting and a ring announcer. Jesus is the small underdog. Satan is a giant red mountain of a man. And the twist of the episode, which is genuinely sweet in its way, is that Satan throws the fight to punish the townspeople for betting against Jesus. The crowd has bet on Satan to win. Satan exposes that bet by losing on purpose. The show, in its very first season, used a literal heavyweight match between the Son of God and the literal devil to make a point about hypocrisy in the audience's own pews. That episode set a template South Park has returned to again and again. The supernatural is real here. Heaven is real. Hell is real, depicted in many later episodes as a kind of dingy underground concert venue full of celebrities and historical villains. Satan is often the most emotionally articulate character in any room he is in. Jesus is calm, soft-spoken, and occasionally pushed to extreme violence when the script demands it. The afterlife is mapped, and against all of that, the human characters tend to behave with the same blinkered selfishness whether or not they have personally met the divine. It is also worth pausing on the matter-of-fact way Jesus is drawn. He has a beard, he has long hair, he wears the white robe and red sash and looks basically like every Sunday school illustration, most American children of a certain generation grew up looking at. The show did not reinvent his image. It used the most familiar Western depiction of Jesus and dropped him into a satirical sitcom about a mountain town. The choice is deliberate. The point, again, is not the strangeness of Jesus. The point is the strangeness of the people around him. In later seasons, the character of Jesus is given less screen time, but he is never quite retired. He returns in the Imaginationland three-parter, where the imaginary creatures of human history are at war with each other, and there he is fighting alongside other figures from myth and fiction, treated as if his canonical strength as a character is partly a matter of how many people remember him. He returns in special episodes around Easter and around Christmas. He returns in stranger sequences across the later seasons, sometimes weaponized, sometimes just sitting quietly in the back of a scene. The show keeps him on the bench, but does not retire him. He is part of the cast. And the deeper effect of all this is that by the time the show starts taking on individual religions for full episode treatments, it has already done something that almost no other satirical show on television had done before. It has normalized the literal presence of religion in its own world. So when South Park later goes after Catholicism, or Mormonism, or Scientology, or Judaism, or Islam, or atheism, it is not coming from the position of an outside spectator throwing rocks at a stained glass window. It is coming, oddly enough, from the position of a town where the Son of God does the local cable show and where the Devil's Kid sits in the 4th grade. There is a strange democracy to it. Every religion the show takes on is brought into the same room, sat down on the same studio couch, and asked the same hard questions. Before we go into those individual fights, it is worth lingering on the origin a little longer because the original short film that became South Park is itself a religious story. The Spirit of Christmas, in its better-known 1995 version, is structured around a literal theological argument. Jesus comes to town claiming that Christmas is about him. Santa comes to town claiming that Christmas is about him. They fight, the boys watch the fight, horrified. And the resolution is not that one of them wins. The resolution is that the boys eventually conclude that Christmas is about something else entirely, something quieter and more domestic, the act of giving to people you love. It is, in its way, a fairly orthodox sermon, dressed up in obscene cartoon clothing. That tension between the obscene presentation and the often surprisingly orthodox conclusion is the engine of the show. Trey Parker, in interviews over the years, has talked openly about being raised in a religious household and about retaining a kind of spiritual seriousness, even as he and Matt Stone built a career making fun of every faith they could find. That seriousness leaks into the writing. It is why the religious episodes, even the angriest ones, almost never end with a flat dismissal of belief. They tend to end with a small, sincere statement about what people get out of having something to believe in, even if the specific thing being believed in is treated as ridiculous. This is the lens through which everything that follows tonight should be watched. The show is not, at heart, an atheist sermon dressed as a cartoon. It is something stranger. It is a satire by people who appear to find religion both genuinely funny and genuinely necessary, and who keep returning to it because they cannot quite leave it alone. Over the course of the next few hours, we will move slowly through the major skirmishes, the controversies that made the news, the small jokes that only the patient viewer notices, the recurring characters that come back across decades, and the strange running theology that has built up underneath the show, whether the show meant to build it or not. And we will start at the place the show itself almost always starts, with the holiday that gave it its name and its first joke, and with the small, confused boy who, more than any other character on this show, is the one through whom religion is constantly being explained. In the first season, around Christmas, the show airs an episode about a piece of singing excrement. The episode is Mr. Hankey, the Christmas poo. It is one of the most famous early episodes the show ever produced. The plot is built around a Christmas pageant in the elementary school that is slowly being stripped of all religious content because the various parents in the town are offended by everything. The Christmas tree comes down because it offends the non-Christians. The menorah comes down because it offends the Christians. The nativity is removed. The carols are rewritten. By the time the pageant arrives, there is nothing left in it. And in the middle of all of this is Kyle Broflovski, who is Jewish, sitting at the family table during the holiday season feeling profoundly out of step with everything around him. Kyle has been the show's quiet religious center from the very beginning, and Mr. Hankey is the first episode that really leans into it. He sings a song about being a lonely Jew on Christmas. He is teased by Cartman. He is sent off into the snow with the half-mocking suggestion from the other boys that he should believe in his own talking Christmas figure, the way the Christian kids get to believe in Santa. And so he ends up alone in a bathroom, having what is treated as a quietly genuine spiritual experience, even though the entity that arrives to comfort him is, by design, an obscene cartoon joke. The episode is doing something unusual. It is mocking the visual form of the religious experience while honestly portraying the emotional content of it. Kyle is a small boy in a town where his own faith is invisible during the season everyone else cares about, and the show treats that loneliness as real. That tension would become the foundation of Kyle's character across more than 2 decades. He is, in some episodes, the bearer of the show's moral seriousness, which often shades into something close to a religious seriousness. He is the one who tends to deliver the closing speech, the one who tends to be hurt when the others get casual about cruelty, the one who feels his Jewishness most as a kind of inherited responsibility rather than just a label. The show puts him in any number of compromising situations across the years. It sends him to Jewish summer camp where his friend dies. It puts him on the bench during the Passion of the Christ debate. It makes him the lone reluctant economist in the Margaritaville episode. It pulls him toward the cross at the climax of a story about the financial crisis. But the foundation of all of that is laid in the first season, in the Mr. Hankey episode, where the smallest, quietest joke is not the talking poo at all. It is the image of Kyle alone in his room with his menorah, surrounded by a season that does not include him. The show has returned to that loneliness many times since. A later episode follows him as the only kid in school who has to leave his Christian friends behind for a summer at Jewish camp. The camp is treated affectionately, even when the show makes a meal of how the boys complain about the food and the songs and the lectures. Kenny dies during that storyline. He always dies in the early seasons. But the way he dies is grafted onto a Jewish religious narrative, and the episode goes out of its way to be reasonably accurate about the Jewish practices it depicts. The summer camp song, the references to figures of the religious narrative, the small theological points that the boys argue over while staring up at the ceiling of their bunk. The show is, in its own way, doing the work. It is treating Judaism as a lived religion rather than a punchline. It is letting Kyle be a small Jewish boy at a Jewish camp without dismantling either his faith or the camp. By the 8th season, when the show takes on the Mel Gibson film about the Passion of the Christ, Kyle is the character it routes the entire story through. That episode, The Passion of the Jew, is one of the show's most direct interrogations of how religious media affects ordinary believers. Cartman, in the episode, sees the film and is so moved by what he thinks it says about Jewish people that he becomes the leader of an organized group of followers who march around the town in costume, chanting in German, openly fantasizing about violence. The show is being extremely deliberate. It is showing what happens when a piece of religious art, however earnest its creator, gives permission to people who already wanted that permission. Cartman is not radicalized by the film does not change him. It simply confirms what he already believed and dresses that belief in the trappings of religious sincerity. Kyle, meanwhile, watches the film and is shaken by it. He convinces himself that he has somehow personally betrayed Jesus, and he tries to make amends to Stan and Kenny. The two responses run in parallel. The film does not produce one effect, it produces two, and the show is interested in both. The episode is also one of the funnier ones the show has ever done about Mel Gibson, the person, who appears in cartoon form as a man so devoted to the film he made that he has lost most of his other faculties. The writers were careful, in interviews around the time the episode aired, never to claim that they had personally diagnosed Mel Gibson with anything. They were making a satirical character out of a public figure. But the satire is sharp enough that the episode has lingered in the cultural memory in a way that surprised even the people who made it. The final speech of the episode is delivered, of course, by Kyle. He stands in front of a crowd of would-be marchers and says, in essence, that if Christians want to learn from the Passion, they should look at what Jesus actually taught, and that what Jesus actually taught is not contained in a film that mostly consists of a man being slowly tortured for 2 hours. It is one of the most morally direct things any character has said on the show, and the speech is given by the only Jewish kid in the room, The other ongoing thread that runs through Kyle's religious arc is his relationship with Cartman. Cartman is, from the very first season, an explicit and sustained anti-Semite, and the show treats his anti-Semitism not as something to be excused or softened, but as one of the central facts of his character. He says terrible things to Kyle about Kyle's faith and about Jewish people in general. He sometimes acts on those things. He plots, schemes, ridicules, and occasionally tries to physically harm Kyle on anti-Semitic grounds. The show, again, does not soften any of this. It puts it on the screen and lets the audience sit with how much they are willing to laugh at and how much they are willing to recoil from. Kyle, in response, is forever being placed in the position of having to either ignore Cartman or to confront him, and over the course of the seasons, the show has carefully tracked the cost of both options. Kyle's anger, his exhaustion, his quiet despair at being the one who is constantly being asked to bear this has shaped the character into something more than a comic foil. He is, in many of the most serious episodes the show has ever produced, the closest thing it has to a conscience. And his conscience is, more often than not, a Jewish one. If Jesus is the show's quiet upstairs neighbor, Satan is its loud and emotionally complicated downstairs one. He is one of the most carefully written characters on the entire show, and across the seasons he has been given a fuller inner life than most of the human cast. He is a large, red-horned man with enormous shoulders and a soft voice. He cries. He keeps a journal of his feelings. He goes to the gym. He has long stretches of being in a serious romantic relationship with Saddam Hussein, which is one of the strangest running plots in the history of network television, in which the show plays out with an oddly genuine emotional honesty. Satan is, in these episodes, the partner who wants to be loved properly and who keeps choosing the wrong person. The show treats him as a person who is unhappy with his job, his life, his afterlife, and his choices. It treats him, in other words, the way it treats most of its protagonists. It just happens that his name is Satan. In the South Park feature film, which is set partly in hell, that relationship between Satan and Saddam becomes one of the load-bearing emotional storylines. There is a musical number in which Satan sings to himself in a private moment about wanting something else, somewhere up there where the sun shines. It is a sincere ballad. It is performed by a man with horns who is sweating in lava light, and it is genuinely moving in the moment, in part because the show takes its own joke seriously enough to give it the full power ballad treatment. The film, like most of the show, refuses to let the joke stay a joke. Whatever character is on screen, the show insists that you take the feeling behind them seriously, even when the costume is absurd. The mapping of hell across the seasons has become one of the show's strange running gags. Hell is not a place of torment in any traditional Catholic sense. It is depicted as a kind of underground city full of historical figures and recently deceased celebrities. There are running jokes about which famous people end up there. There are running jokes about how, in the show's own theology, Mormons are explicitly the only ones who got it right. That joke comes from one of the season 4 episodes, in which a character is shown hell and learns that everyone who is not Mormon is there, including all the well-behaved Catholics, all the well-behaved Protestants, all the well-behaved Jews, all the well-behaved Buddhists, all the well-behaved Muslims, and everyone else. The audience is shown the line of newly arrived souls being told calmly that it was a different denomination that turned out to be correct. The joke is one of the most concentrated theological jokes the show has ever told because it makes a serious argument inside a punchline. The argument is that if you actually believe in a religion that says only its members go to heaven, you are implicitly believing that all of your kind, generous, decent neighbors are in hell. The show is asking the question in cartoon form. It is letting the audience laugh first and feel the question later. Damien himself, the son of Satan, appears in that first season episode and then largely disappears from the show. The episode that introduced him built out the basic mechanics of the supernatural in the show's world. Damien arrives in town because his father has decided to send him to a normal earthly school. He is shunned by the other children who are afraid of him, until the boxing match at the center of the episode reframes him. The episode is built like a Western. The new kid in town is dangerous. The new kid in town is misunderstood. The new kid in town leaves, but the episode also establishes that hell can communicate directly with Earth, and that heaven and hell are both real places with real chains of command. The show would later complicate that picture, adding tiers of celebrity in hell, adding figures of various kinds in heaven, including at one stretch a running joke about heaven recruiting residents for a basketball team. The cosmology is treated lightly, but it stays consistent enough across the years that the audience knows where everyone ends up. There is an upstairs and there is a downstairs. The doors between them open more often than they should. The character of Satan is given his most extended treatment across the early and middle seasons, where he tends to appear in episodes built around weddings, breakups, parties, or moments of personal crisis. He throws a party in one of those episodes and invites all of the famous people in his downstairs apartment, and the episode plays out like a sitcom about a man who cannot quite organize his own social life. He has long conversations with Kenny, who, because Kenny dies so often in the early seasons, spends a great deal of his afterlife wandering around hell. He has been depicted in family therapy. He has been depicted at a self-help workshop. He has been depicted in one of the more memorable episodes as the executive in charge of an entirely terrestrial Halloween party. He is, in almost every appearance, a character of feeling rather than menace. The deliberate decision to make Satan emotionally available and Jesus emotionally calm is one of the strangest theological inversions in the show. In most American animation, the devil is a figure of menace, mockery, and seduction. Jesus, when he appears at all, is either a vague benevolence or a sermon. South Park gives Jesus the calm and Satan the feelings. Jesus is the one who counsels other people through their pain. Satan is the one being counseled. The effect, watched in sequence, is that the show creates a divine pair in which the savior is the older brother quietly listening at the kitchen table, and the devil is the younger one weeping over a breakup. It is not an orthodox depiction by any tradition. It is its own theology, built quietly across the seasons. And in those quiet portrayals of the afterlife, the show does something that most overt satires of religion do not bother to do. It thinks about what dying might feel like, what waking up after death might feel like, what it might be like to be confused and frightened and surrounded by strangers in a new place with rules nobody explained to you. The hell episodes are full of moments like that. New arrivals look around in confusion. A guide explains things to them. They sit on a couch and have a drink and try to come to terms with their new permanent address. The show does the same thing it does with Kyle in the Christmas episode. It mocks the surface and honors the feeling. It draws hell like a college dormitory and lets the loneliness of the recently dead come through anyway. It is one of the show's most underrated achievements, and almost nobody talks about it as a religious portrayal at all, because the surface jokes are so loud that the quiet underneath them is easy to miss. There is a kind of grace, finally, in the way the show keeps coming back to Jesus and Satan as roommates in the same theological universe. They do not fight after that first episode in any serious way. They mostly leave each other alone. They acknowledge each other in passing. They share a town. They share a school district. They share, in some sense, a satirical landlord. And that shared landscape is the necessary foundation for everything the show would later do with the world's organized religions. Before South Park went after the Catholic Church, before it went after Scientology, before it went after Islam in the way that nearly costed everything, it built a small Colorado town in which God's Son and the literal devil were just two more residents of a community of people who could not always tell the difference between the spiritually significant and the everyday. That is, in many ways, the deepest joke the show has ever told about religion. The thing you are looking for is already in the room with you. You just have to recognize it. The first time the show goes after a real organized religion in a sustained, deliberate way, it picks the Catholic Church. The episode is Red Hot Catholic Love, and it airs in the 6th season in 2002, at the height of one of the worst public scandals in the modern history of the church. That context matters because the episode does not exist in a vacuum. The news at the time was full of reporting about the abuse of children by priests and dioceses across the United States, and about the way the institutional church had spent decades moving accused priests from parish to parish rather than confronting what they had done. The episode aired into that conversation. It did not invent it, it responded to it. The plot of the episode is structured around a small subplot in the town in which the parents of South Park decide to begin defecating through their mouths instead of in the conventional way. That is a deliberate piece of body horror absurdity that the show puts at the front and center of its A-plot in order to make a point about distraction. The town is so absorbed in this disgusting new fad that nobody is paying attention to what is happening in the local Catholic Church. which is exactly where the episode wants the camera. Father Maxey, the recurring Catholic priest character on the show, finds himself at the center of a much bigger storyline. He travels to a kind of high council of the church in order to raise the issue of priests harming children, and what he finds there is a slow, horrifying set piece in which the institutional church is depicted as being unable to imagine reform. The other priests at the council respond to his concerns with a series of increasingly absurd justifications and refusals. The episode lands eventually on the suggestion that the Bible should be read as a guide rather than as a rule book, and on a kind of plea for the human side of faith to be allowed to override the institutional one. What is striking about the episode, watched now, is how angry it is. South Park is not always an angry show. Many of its episodes are cool, clever, structurally tidy. Red Hot Catholic Love is not cool. It is one of the rawest things the show has ever produced. The anger is not directed at faith. It is directed at the institutional protection of harm. Father Maxey, the priest who serves as the show's recurring representative of Catholic belief, is not the villain. He is the audience surrogate. The show treats him with sympathy. It puts him in the position of being the only person in the room who is willing to say what should obviously be said, and the episode follows him as he is dismissed, condescended to, and finally forced to take matters into his own hands. The episode aired and immediately became one of the touchstones of the show's reputation. It was praised by some commentators and condemned by others in patterns that did not always break along the lines you might expect. Some Catholic writers defended the episode because they saw it as a sincere, if obscene, plea for institutional reform. Others condemned it because they felt the show had no standing to speak on the issue at all. The conversation that followed the episode was, in its way, the conversation the show had wanted to provoke. It is worth noting that the show had treated Catholicism with considerable affection in episodes before this one. Father Maxey is a recurring figure across the early seasons, often present at funerals, weddings, and town meetings, often providing a wry counterweight to whatever absurdity is unfolding around him. He is not depicted as foolish. He is one of the few adults in the town who is allowed to be both genuinely religious and genuinely intelligent at the same time. The show, having built him into a sympathetic recurring character, was then able to use him as the conscience of the institutional critique in Red Hot Catholic Love. The episode worked because Father Maxey worked. The character had been earned across previous seasons. A few years later, the show returned to Catholicism in a much more incendiary episode, Bloody Mary, in the 9th season. That episode is built around the supposed miracle of a statue of the Virgin Mary that appears to be weeping blood. The townspeople rush to the statue. The local news arrives. Eventually, a small panel of religious figures arrives to investigate the miracle, and what they find is depicted in an extremely crude visual joke involving where exactly the blood is coming from, a joke that the show plays out in the closest possible camera frame. The Pope at the time appears in the episode, examines the statue, and delivers a line that essentially functions as the punchline of the entire story. The episode caused immediate and significant controversy among Catholic viewers and Catholic advocacy groups, and there were calls, some of them organized, for the network to remove the episode from its rotation. The episode has, at various points, been pulled from rotation in certain regions. It remains, by most accounts, one of the most contested episodes in the show's catalog. The show, for its part, has not apologized for it. Trey Parker and Matt Stone have, in interviews over the years, talked about the episode as part of a deliberate policy of refusing to back down from religious satire under public pressure. They have argued that backing down from one religion while taking on another would itself be a form of disrespect, and that the only honest position for a satirist is to treat all religions as equally fair targets. The argument is debatable. The episode is debatable. But the episode is also, watched closely, a much more complicated piece of work than its detractors gave it credit for. The B-plot of the episode is about Stan's father struggling with alcoholism and attending a series of recovery meetings. Those meetings are structured around the language of a higher power. The episode is, in its quieter moments, asking what it means to look for divine intervention as a way out of personal collapse. The Virgin Mary statue and the recovery meeting are placed deliberately in counterpoint, and the episode is interested in the difference between the kind of miracle a frightened person wants and the kind of recovery that requires the person to do the work themselves. The crude joke at the surface of the episode obscures a much more careful argument underneath it. That is the shape of South Park's relationship with the Catholic Church taken as a whole. The institutional critique in red-hot Catholic love is fierce, sustained, and angry. The surface mockery in Bloody Mary is loud and confrontational. But the recurring portrayal of an individual believer in the character of Father Maxey is patient and warm. The show is capable of holding both attitudes at the same time. It can savage the institution and protect the individual. It can mock the miracle and respect the recovery. The contradiction is the show's argument. It is the same contradiction that runs through Kyle's experience of Judaism, that runs through the show's eventual treatment of Mormonism, that will run through the long fight with Scientology and the much shorter and more terrifying fight with Islam. The show does not want you to believe or disbelieve. It wants you to notice the gap between what an institution says it is doing and what it is actually doing. And it wants you to notice that the gap is, in almost every case, the place where the suffering happens. In the 7th season, the show airs what is arguably its most fully developed religious episode, all about Mormons. The premise is, on its surface, simple. A new family moves into South Park. The boy in that family is Mormon. Stan is sent to investigate because Cartman dislikes him on sight, and what Stan finds in this new family is the kindest, warmest, most genuinely happy household he has ever been inside. The episode follows him on that first visit. There is a family games night. There is a family song. There is a moment where the father of the household sincerely tells his children that he loves them. Stan is unmoored by it. He cannot work out what is wrong with these people. He keeps waiting for the cruelty to surface. It never does. In parallel, the episode delivers what is, in television history, an unusually patient and unusually thorough telling of the foundational narrative of the Mormon religion. The story of Joseph Smith is told in flashback. The angel, the plates, the hat, the seer stones, the translation, the skeptical witnesses who are asked to verify the existence of the plates. The episode dramatizes the story in detail, and as it dramatizes it, the soundtrack carries a recurring sung refrain that essentially translates the audience's likely skepticism into a chorus of the word that means stupid, repeated over and over. The musical joke is doing a great deal of work. It is letting the show take the founding story of a religion seriously enough to actually depict it, while at the same time signposting how the founding story sounds to a listener who does not already believe. What is striking about the episode is that it does not end where most satires of religion would end. It does not end by saying that the founding story is silly and that therefore the religion is silly. It ends with a speech from the Mormon boy delivered to Stan and to Cartman and to the audience, in which the boy essentially says that he knows what his religion's founding story sounds like to outsiders. He knows that some of it is hard to defend. But he points out that being a Mormon has given his family love, structure, kindness, support, and a way of being in the world. And he asks whether any of the people who are mocking him have built anything in their own lives that compares. The speech is delivered with full sincerity. The episode ends on his face. There is no punchline after it. The audience is left with the argument. That argument is, in some ways, the closest thing the show has ever produced to a thesis statement on religion. The episode is not saying that Mormonism is true. It is not saying that the founding narrative is plausible. It is saying that even if the founding narrative is implausible, the lived practice of the religion may still be valuable, and that the people who get the most out of organized religion are not necessarily getting it because they have rigorously evaluated the metaphysics. They are getting it because the practice supports the life. The episode is, for a satirical cartoon, philosophically careful in a way that the show is not always given credit for. The episode also clearly fed into a much larger creative project that Trey Parker and Matt Stone would undertake several years later. The Book of Mormon, the stage musical they wrote with Robert Lopez, opened on Broadway in 2011 and ran for years to enormous commercial success. The musical was widely praised by critics. By most accounts, it was, surprisingly to many viewers, received with notable grace by the Mormon Church itself, which is widely reported to have taken out advertising in the playbills of theaters where the show was running, suggesting in a friendly tone that members of the audience who had been entertained by the show should consider also reading the actual book. That response, in many ways, validated the position the South Park episode had staked out almost a decade earlier. The Mormons, as a community, were able to take a joke about themselves more gracefully than many other religious institutions had taken jokes about themselves. The show had identified that capacity in advance. It is also worth noting, in passing, the recurring joke from the 4th season episode in which a character is shown the afterlife and learns that all of the souls now in hell are there because the correct religion turned out to be Mormonism. The joke is delivered as a quick aside in the middle of a much larger plot, but it functions as a kind of warm-up for the more extended Mormon episode 3 seasons later. The show was already, in that early gag, signaling that it had paid attention to Mormonism in a way that it had not yet paid attention to most other religions. The joke is funny precisely because it lands with such specificity. It is not a generic everyone goes to hell joke. It is the specific naming of a specific denomination as the unexpected winner, and that specificity tells you that the writers had read enough about Mormonism to know it was an unusually distinct claim. The episode that followed in the 7th season built on that early note. The musical that followed years later built on the episode. The All About Mormons episode is also, quietly, one of the most generous things the show has ever made about being a child in a religious household. Stan, who is the show's most reliable emotional barometer, ends the episode in a confused but visibly affected state. He has met a family that has something he does not have, and the episode treats his confusion as legitimate. It does not punish him for being moved. It does not have him snap back into a comfortable mockery at the end. He simply leaves the Mormon family's house quieter than he arrived, and the show does not undo what he saw. That is unusual. Many sitcoms reset their characters at the end of every episode in order to keep the formula intact. South Park, especially in its middle period, was willing to let small experiences leave small marks. The encounter with the Mormon family is one of those small marks. Stan walks out of that house a slightly different boy. He does not become Mormon. He does not become anything in particular. He just carries the encounter with him into the next episode, and the episode after that in the way that small kindnesses tend to be carried. That episode also sits in a kind of polite conversation with the other religion-focused episode of that season, Christian Rock Hard, which we will turn to in a moment. The 2 episodes air within weeks of each other. They are doing very different jobs. One is a careful, almost respectful exploration of what a sincere faith looks like inside a family. The other is a savage and very funny attack on the cynicism of an industry that uses Christian iconography to sell mediocre records. The fact that the writers of the show were producing both of those episodes at the same time tells you almost everything you need to know about their position on religion. They were never simply for or against. They were always sorting belief into the part that helps people and the part that exploits them. The Mormons in their telling were on one side of that line. The contemporary Christian music industry was, in their telling, on the other. Christian Rock Hard is an episode about Cartman, which means it is an episode about appetite. Cartman, who has at this point in the show been written for several seasons as a kind of avatar of pure want, decides that he and the other boys should form a band. The other boys want to make music they actually like. Cartman wants to make money. The 2 ambitions split the group apart, and Cartman, in a fit of pique, announces that he can make more money faster by writing Christian rock music than they can by playing whatever it is they want to play. He bets them that he can produce a record that will go what he calls double platinum, and the rest of the episode is essentially a long, savage satire of a particular slice of the contemporary American Christian music industry. The mechanism by which Cartman makes Christian rock is one of the most concentrated jokes the show has ever told. He takes love songs of the most generic possible romantic pop variety, and he rewrites them by replacing the word baby with the word Jesus. That is, in his telling, the entire industry strategy. The episode demonstrates the technique in action. Songs that were obviously about romantic longing are transformed into songs that appear to be about religious longing simply by swapping the object of the longing. The audience for the in-show band, depicted as a vast crowd of believers, embraces the music without ever apparently noticing that the songs are not really about what they appear to be about. The joke is not at the expense of the believers. The joke is at the expense of the industry that produces the records and the artists who have figured out that this trick will work. The episode is also one of the rare South Park episodes in which Cartman, who is almost never punished for his schemes, is punished in a small but biting way. The exact mechanism of his eventual humiliation comes down to the fine print of the certification process for what counts as a platinum record in the Christian music industry, and Cartman's tantrum on stage when he realizes he has lost the bet on a technicality is one of the most quoted scenes the show has ever produced. The B-plot of the episode involves the other boys discovering early music piracy, with a great deal of material about the early Napster era and about the way the music industry was responding to digital downloads. But the religious A-plot is what most viewers remember because it landed so cleanly. The episode said something true about a real corner of the music business, and it said it in less than 22 minutes, and it said it through the mouth of a fat fourth grader with no scruples and an electric guitar. The conjunction of All About Mormons and Christian rock hard in the same season makes the show's position visible in a way that it usually is not. It is not that the show is for or against any particular religion, it is that the show makes a sharp distinction between the practice of belief and the marketing of belief. The Mormon family is shown practicing belief and is treated with care. The Christian rock industry is shown marketing belief and is treated with contempt. The episodes are not really about Mormonism or about Protestantism. They are about the difference between a thing that helps people live and a thing that takes money from people in exchange for a flattering imitation of the thing that helps them live. That distinction runs through almost every religious episode the show has ever made, and it is the distinction that lets the show be, simultaneously, one of the most aggressive satires of organized religion on television and one of the most surprisingly gentle ones. Stepping back a few seasons, the show's earliest large-scale attempt at writing about world religion comes in the 5th season episode, Super Best Friends. The episode is built around a parody of stage magic. A celebrity magician character named David Blaine arrives in town and quickly becomes the center of a kind of cult of personality. He performs feats that look like miracles. He gathers a large group of devoted followers. He convinces them to dress alike, to live together, to give up their old lives, and eventually he leads them in an act of organized harm. The boys, alarmed by what is happening, eventually summon a group called the Super Best Friends in order to stop him. The Super Best Friends are, in the episode's framing, a kind of Justice League composed of the founders, or major figures of the world's major religions. Jesus is on the team. So are figures representing several other major faiths. They each have a power, drawn loosely from the tradition associated with them. They fight alongside each other against the false magician. The episode is, even by the standards of the show, a remarkable thing. It is one of the very few attempts in American animation to treat the figures of multiple religions as a coordinated team of more or less equal stature. By most accounts, it depicts Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, on screen as one of the members of the team in a way that, at the time, did not provoke significant public controversy. The episode aired before the larger global conversation about depictions of Muhammad in Western media had reached the temperature it would reach a few years later, and the depiction in Super Best Friends went largely unremarked upon at the time. The show would later, in the early Cartoon Wars two-parter, return to that episode as proof that the network had at one point allowed an unbleeped depiction of the Prophet. By then, the climate had changed, and the show was no longer permitted by its own network to repeat the depiction. But before all of that, before any of the controversies, Super Best Friends is just an episode in which a group of religious founders teams up to take down a stage magician. The joke is light, the execution is affectionate. The boys are saved at the end by a coordinated act of cooperation between figures from several different faiths. The implication, never spoken aloud, is that the various religions of the world have more in common with each other than they have in conflict, and that the real enemy is not any one religion but the figure who exploits the credulity of others for personal power. The David Blaine character in the episode is a stand-in for that kind of figure, and the religious founders are mobilized in the episode to stop him. It is a sweeter episode than its later legacy in the Cartoon Wars controversies might suggest. It is, in its own quiet way, one of the most ecumenical things the show has ever done. The episode also gives us the show's first sustained character treatment of a number of figures from different traditions, including Joseph Smith, the Buddha, Krishna, Muhammad, Lao Tzu, and several other figures who would otherwise have only appeared in passing. The decision to put all of them on a team together is not particularly mocking, it is closer to fan fiction. The writers, who have always been students of religious history in their own way, were assembling the action figure version of their own bookshelf. The fact that the episode was later used as a pivot point in one of the most serious creative controversies of the show's history is, in its way, an accident of the time. When the episode aired, it was an oddity. By the time the network was making decisions about reruns and about depictions, the episode had become a touchstone, and the depiction of one of its members had become a piece of evidence in a much larger argument about what could and could not be shown on American television. That argument arrives formally in the 10th season in a two-part episode called Cartoon Wars. The two episodes air in April of 2006, and they aired into a global news moment. A Danish newspaper had, the previous autumn, published a series of cartoons depicting the Prophet Muhammad, and the publication had set off months of international protest, violence, and diplomatic strain. Networks and newspapers around the world were making decisions about whether to reproduce the cartoons or to describe them without showing them. The conversation was, at the time, the dominant story in any newsroom that dealt with the press's relationship to religion. South Park, which had at that point depicted Muhammad in super best friends without any visible consequence, decided to set its own two-parter inside that exact conversation. The plot of Cartoon Wars is, on its surface, a satire of Family Guy. The fictional Family Guy on the show announces that it will air an episode in which the Prophet Muhammad appears as a character. The American population goes into a panic. Various authorities recommend that everyone bury their heads in the sand, literally, in order to avoid being targeted in any potential reprisal. The boys travel to the headquarters of Family Guy to try to influence the decision. Cartman, in particular, becomes obsessed with the Family Guy episode for reasons that are revealed slowly across the two parts, and that turn out to have nothing to do with religious sensitivity and everything to do with his personal hatred of the rival show. The plot is, in one of its many layers, the show's settling of an old creative score with a competitor. But underneath that comic plot is a real argument about a real piece of network policy. The episode shows the moment in which the depiction of the prophet is, in the show's fictional universe, about to be broadcast. And then the screen cuts to black, and a card appears, explaining that the network has refused to allow the depiction to be shown. That card is real. It is a piece of real network policy being acknowledged in the show itself. South Park, the actual show, was at that point not being permitted by its own broadcaster to depict the prophet on screen, even within the context of a story that was explicitly about the question of whether the prophet could be depicted on screen. The card on the screen is the show telling the audience, in as direct a way as it has ever told the audience anything, that there is a line it is not being allowed to cross. The second part of Cartoon Wars then does something that almost no other show on American television was doing at the time. It includes a long speech delivered by Kyle to the head of the fictional broadcaster, in which he argues that if the network allows itself to be edited by the threat of violence in one case, then every future content decision is going to be made by the people most willing to threaten violence. It is one of the most direct speeches the show has ever produced. It is delivered without irony. It is the show, through Kyle, asking the audience to consider what happens when the editorial line is drawn by fear. The speech is not a religious speech, it is a press freedom speech, but it is being delivered in an episode that is explicitly about a religion, and the religion in question is being treated with a delicacy that the show does not extend to any other religion. The contrast is the point. The episode is not pretending to be even-handed. It is admitting in its own structure that it is not being permitted to be even-handed. Cartoon Wars set the stage for what would happen 4 years later, in the 14th season, when the show returned to the same question for its 200th episode. 200 and the episode that followed it, 201, are some of the most controversial episodes the show has ever produced, and they are some of the most carefully constructed. The story is built around a return of a vast cast of characters from across the show's first 200 episodes, all of whom have been wronged by the boys in one way or another and who arrive in South Park as a kind of plaintiff class. Tom Cruise is among the leaders of this group. Their demand is that the town deliver up the Prophet Muhammad, whose presence in the town would, in the world of the episode, grant the angry celebrities a kind of supernatural protection against further mockery. The plot is elaborate. It is also, in its way, a long argument about the show's own history. The episodes pull together threads from years of previous episodes and place all of them under the same set of pressures. The prophet in those episodes is depicted in a way that is deliberately obscured. He is, at various points, shown wearing a bear costume, which is to say he is depicted as a literal bear standing upright in clothing. He is, at various points, referred to by name without being shown. He is, at various points, blocked by a black box bearing a word, censored within the episode itself. The show is not pretending that the censorship is a creative choice. It is showing the censorship as the censorship. It is letting the audience watch the box. 201 ends with a long monologue delivered by Kyle, which is partially bleeped by the network in a way that the show's creators have publicly said was not their own decision. The bleeped portion of that monologue, by the account of Trey Parker and Matt Stone, does not mention the prophet at all. By their statements after the fact, it is a more general meditation on fear and intimidation, and on the way the world's response to threats reshapes everyone's behavior. The network bleeped it anyway, citing the security concerns of the moment. The result is one of the strangest pieces of television in the show's history. The closing monologue of one of the most ambitious episodes the show ever wrote is partially silenced inside the episode itself, and the silencing has never been undone in any subsequent broadcast. The episode, as it currently exists, contains long stretches of beep over the closing speech. It is a wound on the surface of the show that the show has never tried to heal. The story behind those episodes is one of the more sobering chapters in the show's history. As far as has been publicly reported, the episodes provoked threats against the lives of Trey Parker and Matt Stone from at least one online source. Threats that became serious enough that the United States authorities became involved. Both creators have spoken publicly about that period in their lives, and both have said in interviews that the experience changed them. The episode itself has been removed from rotation in several of the show's home territories, and is, on the official streaming platforms, available only in altered or restricted form, depending on the region. The episodes still air, but they air with the bleeps intact, and the bleeps now function as a kind of monument. The audience that watches those episodes today is watching, in part, a piece of television that records what happened to the people who made it. The bleep is the gravestone. Long before 201, the show had picked another fight with another religion that, in its way, defined the rest of the show's history. In the 9th season, in 2005, South Park aired an episode called Trapped in the Closet. The episode is, on its face, about Stan, who, after taking a free personality test for reasons of childhood curiosity, is identified by the Church of Scientology as the reincarnation of L. Ron Hubbard, the church's founder. The plot rapidly accumulates new characters. Tom Cruise comes to South Park to meet the new prophet. So does John Travolta. So does R. Kelly, who is, in one of the show's many overlapping satirical layers, also the name behind an unrelated song series of the same name as the episode. The premises pile on top of each other. The episode is structurally one of the show's more elaborate set pieces. The episode contains, in its center, a long and deliberately straightforward dramatization of the foundational cosmology of Scientology. The episode walks the audience through what the church believes about Xenu and the cosmic events that supposedly took place tens of millions of years ago. As the show dramatizes the story, a small caption appears in the corner of the screen, indicating to the audience that what they are seeing is not a parody, but is, in fact, what the church teaches. The episode is essentially saying to the viewer, on the record, that the details being depicted are not an invention of the writers, but are a description of beliefs that the church holds to be true. The caption is a kind of editorial signature. The show, in its own voice, is asking the viewer to take seriously what is being depicted. Tom Cruise, in the episode, is given a sustained joke that quickly became one of the most quoted things the show has ever produced. He is, at one point in the story, hiding in Stan's bedroom closet and refusing to come out. And the various characters of the episode spend the rest of the episode pleading with him to come out of the closet. The double meaning is, of course, the joke. The episode never says anything explicit about Tom Cruise's actual personal life. It does not need to. The phrase recurs across the rest of the episode in every variation the writers can find. And by the end of the episode, the phrase has carried so much narrative weight that the entire room of characters is shouting it at the closet door. The phrase entered the cultural memory in a way that almost no other South Park line has. It has been quoted in newspaper headlines. It has been used as a phrase in articles about a great many unrelated public figures. It became, in some sense, a permanent piece of the show's contribution to the English language. The fallout from Trapped in the Closet was significant. The episode reportedly created tensions inside the production of the show itself. Isaac Hayes, the soul singer who had voiced the character of Chef from the show's first season, was a member of the Church of Scientology. After the episode aired, Hayes left the show, and the circumstances around his departure were and remain disputed in their details. The show's creators have publicly said that they believe Hayes left because of the Scientology episode, and have argued that he had not previously objected to the show's treatment of other religions. The estate of Isaac Hayes has, at various points, disputed elements of that account, suggesting that he was at the time in poor health and that the decision to leave may have been more complicated. What is not disputed is that Hayes left the show, that Chef was written out of the show in the following season, and that Chef's exit from the show is one of the strangest endings any beloved recurring character has ever received in a long-running American animated series. The episode in which Chef is written out, which aired at the start of the 10th season, is one of the more openly bitter episodes the show has ever produced. The character, who has been a moral anchor for the boys across 9 seasons, returns to South Park after having joined a fictional group that is portrayed as having significant resemblances to a certain real-life organization. He is depicted as having been changed. His behavior is altered. He does things that the character would never have done in earlier seasons. And eventually, in a sequence that is genuinely shocking even by the show's standards, he dies on screen in a series of consecutive accidents that look, in their cartoonish brutality, like a kind of catharsis. At the end of the episode, the boys eulogize him. They blame the organization that they believe took him from them. They make their feelings public. The episode is, by the standards of any other show, an act of grief expressed through fictional violence. By the standards of South Park, it is an unusually unrestrained piece of writing. The show, which has built almost its entire personality around the principle of not letting anything stay sacred, found itself for once in the position of writing a sincere funeral. The Trapped in the Closet episode has had its own complicated afterlife. As far as fans have pieced together, there were reports at the time of its initial broadcast that subsequent reruns of the episode were canceled or rescheduled at the network's discretion. Although the precise details and motives behind those scheduling decisions have been the subject of years of speculation. The episode has been pulled from rotation at various points and restored to rotation at other points. It is, on most streaming platforms, currently available, but it has not had the same easy life in the catalog as the show's less controversial episodes. The cultural conversation around the episode has shifted considerably across the past 2 decades, as the public conversation about the Church of Scientology itself has shifted. A great deal of investigative journalism and several documentaries have come out since the episode aired, and a great deal of what those investigations have revealed had already been in cartoon form in the South Park episode. The episode was, in a real sense, ahead of the journalism. There is a moment near the end of the episode in which Stan, having been declared the reincarnated prophet, decides to take his role seriously and to use it for what he sees as the good of the religion. He writes what he believes will be a new and more honest piece of doctrine, and he attempts to deliver it to the assembled congregation. The reaction of the church to his attempt is depicted as fury. The audience is asked to draw its own conclusion about what that fury implies. Stan, finally, in a scene that has been read by many viewers as the closing argument of the entire episode, dares the church to sue him. The line is delivered with the flat affect of a 4th grader who does not understand the legal weight of what he is saying. The episode ends, in some versions, with a long credit sequence in which almost every name is replaced by a deliberately generic Anglo-Saxon placeholder, in what is widely understood to be a self-protective gesture by the production team. The credits, watched with that context in mind, are one of the most quietly defiant things the show has ever broadcast. The same season that gave us Cartoon Wars also gave us a 2-part episode about the opposite end of the religious spectrum. Go God, Go and Go. God, Go. The 12th and the 10th season are about atheism. They air in the wake of the public success of a wave of writers and broadcasters, often grouped together under the loose label of the New Atheism, most famously the British biologist Richard Dawkins, whose book on the subject was at the time near the top of the bestseller lists. The episode brings Dawkins into the show as a character. He arrives in South Park as a guest speaker at the elementary school. He begins, in the episode, a romantic relationship with the school's already established gender transition teacher, Mrs. Garrison, in a subplot that the show plays at high volume and that has, in retrospect, become one of the more uncomfortable elements of the episode for modern viewers. The story of Go God Go is built around Cartman, who, for reasons of personal greed unrelated to any religious or philosophical interest, freezes himself in the local mountains in order to skip the time between the present day and the release of a video game system he wants to play. The plan goes wrong. He thaws out instead hundreds of years in the future. And the future he arrives in is a future in which religion has been entirely abolished and in which the world is governed by the principles of organized reason. That sounds initially like the future the new atheist writers might have advocated for. The show then immediately starts pulling that future apart. The future is at war. There are multiple factions of atheists who hate each other. They are killing each other over differences of interpretation in the writings of their founding figure, who is, in a joke the show carries across the entire two-parter, Richard Dawkins himself, treated by the future as a kind of secular prophet. The factions cannot agree on what he meant. They go to war over what he meant. The future is the same future the show has been satirizing for a decade, with the labels swapped. The argument of Go God Go is, in its way, one of the most precise religious arguments the show has ever produced. The episode is saying that the impulse to organize into competing camps over questions that cannot be definitively settled is not a religious impulse. It is a human impulse. The episode is saying that even if you abolished every religion in the world overnight, the human appetite for in-groups and out-groups would simply find a new set of doctrines to fight over, and that the new doctrines would, in time, accumulate exactly the same kind of fervor, exactly the same kind of internal divisions, and exactly the same kind of violence that the old doctrines did. The episode is, in some ways, a defense of religion against the most aggressive criticism of religion, but it is a strange kind of defense. It is not saying that religion is true. It is saying that the alternative is not the absence of religion. It is the rebranding of religion. It is the same shape with a new name. The episode treats Richard Dawkins, the character, with considerable mockery. The romantic subplot is broad. The character is depicted as a man who is so absorbed in his own argument that he has lost the ability to read the room around him. The real Richard Dawkins has, in interviews and writing over the years, said various things about the episode and about the show's treatment of him, and the conversation has continued in fits and starts across the past decade and a half. The episode is not a careful intellectual engagement with the actual arguments of his book. It is, at its strongest, a thought experiment about what would happen if his arguments succeeded and what kind of world they would produce. And the answer the show gives is essentially that the world produced would not be the world he imagined. There is also a small, much quieter subplot in the second half of the two-parter that involves the sea otters. The future, in the episode, is one in which sea otters have evolved to the point of intelligence and have taken their place alongside humans as one of the dominant species on the planet. The sea otters have their own atheist factions. They are also at war over the interpretation of Dawkins. The visual joke is, in its way, one of the most concentrated images the show has ever produced, and it functions as a small piece of evidence for the larger argument. The implication is that the impulse to schism is not even particular to human beings. Anything intelligent enough to have an argument will, given enough time, find a reason to organize that argument into a war. The sea otters are the punchline and the proof at the same time. Go God Go is also, in its own way, a closing argument on the show's relationship with formal atheism. The show has, across its other religious episodes, often been read as an atheist show because of how unsparing it can be in its treatment of organized religion. The Go God Go two-parter is the show's reply to that reading. It is saying, in essence, that the show is not on either side, and that the people who think the show is on their side because the show happens to mock their opponents are not paying attention to how the show treats them. The show is on the side of noticing the patterns. It is on the side of refusing to pick the team. And it is on the side of the small, uncomfortable suggestion that anyone who is sure they have the answers, whether the answers are religious or scientific, is in danger of becoming the thing the show is most consistently going to mock. The episode also occupies an interesting place in the show's larger treatment of time. South Park does not normally engage in long-form continuity. The town reset is one of the most reliable structural features of the show. But Go God Go takes Cartman out of the present and pushes him hundreds of years into the future. and the show has occasionally returned to that future in subsequent episodes for cameos and references. The conceit gives the show access to a long lens that it does not otherwise have. It lets the show ask not what religion looks like now, but what religion might look like centuries from now, and the answer it gives is that it will look the same, with the names changed and with the same arguments running between the same kinds of camps. That long lens, used so rarely in the show's catalog, gives the Go God Go episodes a kind of melancholy that most of the show's religious episodes do not have. It is one of the few episodes that ends on something that looks a little like despair, and that despair is what makes the episode, in retrospect, one of the most quietly serious things the show has ever done. In the 11th season, the show produced its most ambitious story up to that point, the Imaginationland 3-parter. The trilogy is the longest single story the regular run of the show had ever sustained. And it is, beneath its surface plot about a war between imaginary characters, a long extended argument about the nature of belief. The premise of the trilogy is that there is a place called Imaginationland in which every figure ever invented by the human imagination is alive. There are heroes there are villains, there are friendly cartoon animals and cosmic monsters and figures from religion, and figures from advertising, and figures from children's books. They live alongside each other. The trilogy begins when a group of terrorists from the bad side of Imaginationland, which has always been quarantined behind a wall, manages to escape into the good side and to begin killing imaginary characters in a series of large-scale attacks. The premise is silly enough to function as a joke. It is also serious enough to function as a meditation on what it means for something to be real even though it never physically existed. The boys, drawn into the events of Imaginationland through a kind of accidental contact with its inhabitants, are forced to debate repeatedly whether the deaths of imaginary characters matter. Kyle, in particular, finds himself arguing that the characters in Imaginationland are as real as any other thing the human race has ever invested with significance. He delivers, near the end of the trilogy, a speech that essentially says that nothing the human imagination produces is less real than the material world, because the things we imagine shape the world we live in, and the people who live in the world we built are shaped by the imaginings of the people who came before. The speech is, by the standards of the show, a serious one. It is delivered without irony, and it is delivered in a story whose other major character is a portly fourth grader engaged in a long-running legal dispute with another portly fourth grader over what one of them is allowed to do to a portrait of the other. The religious dimension of the trilogy is embedded in the cast of Imaginationland itself. Jesus is one of the imaginary characters who lives in the good side. So are figures from a great many other religious traditions. So are characters from animated films, from comic books, from epic poems, from advertising campaigns, from political cartoons, from every other domain in which the human race has invested a story with shape. The trilogy is, in its way, suggesting that the boundary between religious belief and other kinds of imaginative belief is not as sharp as it is sometimes drawn. The figures of religion live in Imaginationland alongside the figures of fiction. They are not less real than the fictional figures. They are also not more real than the fictional figures. They share a country. They share a war. What the trilogy does not do, and what it could very easily have done, is collapse that observation into a flat dismissal of religion. The story does not say that because Jesus lives in Imaginationland, Jesus is therefore nothing. It says, in Kyle's speech, the opposite. It says that the things that live in Imaginationland have shaped the world more than anything else has, and that to dismiss the imagined is to misunderstand what the human race has actually built. The trilogy is, watched at the right angle, one of the most generous defenses of religious belief the show has ever produced. It just happens to be a defense delivered in a story that also contains a great many obscene jokes and at least one extended set piece in which a child performs a particular act on a particular fictional creature in a courtroom. The combination is the show. The combination is what makes the argument land. The trilogy is also, in passing, the show's most direct engagement with the question of what the United States military would actually do if confronted with the existence of a parallel realm of imaginary beings. The episode is, in some ways, an early piece of satire on the post-9/11 national security state and on the willingness of governments to apply real-world military responses to problems that resist real-world military responses. The Imaginationland of the show is, by the end of the trilogy, occupied by a force that does not understand it and that responds to its problems by trying to destroy them. The parallel to the show's larger political moment is not subtle. The trilogy is, among other things, an essay about the failure of force to engage with the realm of the imaginative, and the parallel between that failure and certain real-world failures of the same period is one of the things that gives the trilogy its quiet weight underneath the noise of its surface jokes. By most accounts, the trilogy was recognized in the form in which it was edited into a single feature, and that recognition reflected, more than anything else the show had produced up to that point, a willingness among critics and industry voters to take the show seriously as a piece of long-form storytelling. The recognition was, in some ways, overdue. The show had been producing long-form storytelling for years before Imaginationland. What Imaginationland did was make the long-form structure visible. It gave critics a single object they could point to as proof that the show was capable of structure, on the scale that prestige television was beginning, in those years, to be expected to produce. The religious argument inside the trilogy was not the part the prestige television conversation tended to notice. But the religious argument is, in retrospect, one of the most coherent things the show has ever said about why religion matters in the first place. It matters because it is one of the things the human race has imagined hardest. And the things the human race imagines hardest are, the trilogy argues, the things that shape what the world becomes. In the 13th season, the show produced an episode called Margaritaville, which is not on its surface a religious episode at all. It is an episode about the financial crisis of the late 2000s and about the strange, dawning realization that the economy is, in many of its essential properties, structured like a religion. The episode arrived at a moment when the United States was still trying to understand what had happened in its banking system, what had caused the collapse, and what kind of recovery was possible. South Park's answer to that question is, in the episode, that the economy is a system of belief. The townspeople who have lost their savings and are responding with increasingly elaborate forms of personal austerity begin to behave like a religious community in penance. They give up consumption, they abandon luxury, they start dressing in plainer clothes, they build a kind of austere parallel society in which the most successful members are the ones who have given up the most. The episode treats their behavior as something between a recovery program and a monastic order, and the show is interested in the precise moment at which the response to a crisis crosses over from rational to ritual. The figure at the center of Margaritaville is Stan's father, who, in the episode's framing, has positioned himself as a kind of prophet of the new austere economy. He preaches in the streets, he has followers, he has rules of behavior that he believes will save the town from further punishment. The townspeople gather to hear him speak. They take his words as guidance. And the episode builds, slowly and carefully, the case that what is happening to them is essentially a religious movement, even though none of them would ever describe it that way. The B-plot of the episode involves Kyle, who, in trying to help a friend pay off a personal debt, takes on the debt himself in a gesture that the episode plays as a kind of substitutionary sacrifice. The visual of the episode at its climax, with Kyle being escorted to a kind of public reckoning while the townspeople line the streets, is constructed to evoke specific religious imagery. The substitution is not subtle. Kyle is taking the debt of others onto himself in order to free them from it, and the episode films that gesture with a deliberate camera language that any viewer raised in a Christian visual tradition will recognize immediately. The argument the episode is making about the economy is, in retrospect, one of the most striking things the show has ever produced. The argument is that the economy is, at root, a system of mutual belief, and that when the belief fails, the system fails, and that the responses available to a community in that situation are not really rational responses at all. They are religious responses. The townspeople of South Park, in the episode, are looking for something to do with their fear and their guilt about the collapse, and the religious frame is the frame they reach for, because the religious frame is the frame the human race has spent thousands of years developing for exactly this kind of fear. The episode is not saying that this is good or bad. It is just saying that it is what people do. And by routing the story through Kyle, the show is implicitly making the further argument that the act of taking another person's burden onto yourself, the act that sits at the center of Christian narrative, is also a recognizable economic act. The two systems, the religious and the financial, share more vocabulary than either one of them likes to admit. That is the argument of Margaritaville, and it is one of the show's quietly best constructed essays. The show returned to the question of religion as a brand a few seasons later in an episode called A Scause for Applause. The episode is built around a kind of national religious revival in which a particular branded wristband, evoking the many real-life charity wristbands that had become popular in the years before the episode aired, becomes a kind of public marker of personal righteousness. The episode follows a moment in which a religious figure of unimpeachable reputation is publicly disgraced for an unrelated reason, and the public, who had been buying the wristbands as a way of associating themselves with the figure, must now decide what to do with their wristbands. The episode is structured as a long meditation on the way that personal identity becomes attached to consumable religious objects, and on the way that the relationship between the believer and the object is more fragile than either party tends to acknowledge. The episode is also one of the most overtly biblical things the show has ever produced in terms of its imagery. The figure at the center of the episode is positioned repeatedly in the visual language of Christ. The episode contains long stretches of music that evoke the soundtracks of religious epic films. The townspeople, in their decision-making about whether to keep wearing the wristbands or to discard them, are framed as participants in something that looks like a public act of faith renunciation. The combination of imagery and the relatively small consumer object at the center of the story is, of course, the joke. The episode is asking how serious anything is allowed to be when the object of the seriousness is a plastic bracelet that you bought at a gas station. And the answer the episode gives is, characteristically, both that the object is silly and that the seriousness with which people invest it is not silly at all. The seriousness is the real thing. The object is just the carrier. That observation, that the seriousness is the real thing and the object is just the carrier, runs through the show's later religious episodes more strongly than it runs through its earlier ones. The earlier religious episodes tend to be more interested in specific institutions and specific practices. The later episodes tend to be more interested in the underlying need that religious behavior serves, and in the way that need finds new objects when the old objects are no longer available. The faith healing episode in the 16th season is one of the most concentrated examples of that later pattern. The episode is built around a series of internet meme behaviors that pass through the elementary school as a kind of social fashion. Each meme is treated by the school as if it were a religious heresy or a religious revival, depending on whether the school's authorities approve of it. The episode is mostly comic. It is mostly about the rapid cycle of internet fashion, but underneath it, in the way the school authorities behave, is a careful observation about the structures of religious gatekeeping and about the way those structures attach themselves to whatever new social practice has become temporarily fashionable. The episode is, in essence, an argument that the impulses that built organized religion have not gone away in the secular online age. They have just moved into new institutions with new vocabularies and new objects to be reverent about and new objects to be heretical about. The cycle is the same, only the iconography has changed. The show has also, in a number of episodes scattered across its later seasons, used the figure of Cartman to explore the structure of religious leadership itself. Cartman is, by the show's own internal logic, a kind of dark messianic figure. He has, in episode after episode, gathered followers, founded movements, started cults, started bands, started schools of thought, and used the structure of religious devotion to advance his own personal interests. He has been depicted in various episodes as the leader of a small religious community of his own, as the figure at the center of a wave of social panic, as the inventor of a series of doctrines that the other children find themselves accepting against their better judgment. The recurring use of Cartman in this role is one of the show's longest-running jokes, and it is also one of its most pointed religious commentaries. The show is making, across years, the argument that the human appetite for a charismatic leader is largely indifferent to the moral content of the leader's beliefs. Cartman is a small, obese, cruel child with no scruples and no compassion, and he is again and again capable of organizing other people around himself. The show is not saying that all religious leaders are like Cartman. It is saying that the appetite that Cartman is able to exploit is the same appetite that any religious leader, good or bad, relies on. The mechanism is morally neutral. The mechanism can be used by anyone. It is worth returning for a moment to the Passion of the Jew episode because the closer you look at it, the more it gives back. The episode aired in 2004 in the immediate aftermath of the theatrical release of Mel Gibson's film about the final hours of the life of Christ. The film was, at the time, one of the most successful religious films in the history of cinema by box office, and the cultural conversation around it was as intense as any conversation about a religious film had been for decades. There were arguments about its violence, there were arguments about its theology, there were arguments, most consequentially for the South Park episode, about whether the film's portrayal of certain figures in the story was likely to encourage anti-Semitic readings or attitudes in audiences who saw it. That conversation was the conversation South Park stepped into, and the show stepped into it with a directness that very few of its contemporaries were willing to match. The structure of the episode is, in some ways, a small miracle of compression. The episode runs for about 22 minutes. In that time, it stages 3 distinct responses to the film. Stan and Kenny go to see the film at Cartman's recommendation and come out of it deeply confused, and their confusion shapes the rest of the storyline. Cartman, having seen the film several times, has come away with what he understands to be theological permission to organize around his existing anti-Semitism, and he begins to gather a group of followers. Kyle, finally, who is at first skeptical and then deeply shaken by the film, attempts to take its message into his own conscience and ends up apologizing for things he cannot have done because he was not present at events that took place thousands of years before his birth. The 3 responses run in parallel. The episode is interested in all 3. The episode is not interested in saying which one is correct. The episode is interested in showing how the same film can produce 3 responses simultaneously, and how each of those responses tells you something about the person who had it. The Cartman thread, in particular, is one of the most carefully written things in the show's catalog. Cartman, who has been the show's anti-Semite from the first season, finds in the film a kind of permission. He does not need the film to introduce him to his prejudices. The film simply provides a vocabulary in which his existing prejudices can be expressed in public without immediate social cost. The other followers he gathers are people who, the episode strongly implies, are not bad people in any obvious sense. They are people who have been moved by the film and who have, in their moved state, allowed themselves to follow a leader who is offering them a frame in which the film's emotional intensity can be channeled into action. That action turns out to be a march, in costume, with chants, with a banner, with all of the visual language of a small modern hate movement. The episode films that march carefully. It does not soften the visuals. It does not let the comic frame around the events dilute what is being depicted. The viewer is asked to look at the march and to understand what the march is in real history, and to understand that the film at the center of the episode has helped to produce it. The Kyle thread in Counterpoint is one of the show's gentlest pieces of writing about religious guilt. Kyle, having seen the film, takes its accusatory portrayal of his ancestors with a child's literal seriousness and tries to make amends in his own life for events he had no part in. He approaches Stan, he approaches Kenny, he tries to take responsibility, and the episode treats his attempt with a tenderness that very few of the show's other religious storylines have been allowed. There is no laughing at Kyle in his moment of crisis. There is only the slow, growing understanding on his part that the film has placed a guilt on him that does not really belong to him. The episode does not resolve his crisis with a flippant line. It resolves it with the same speech at the end of the episode that we mentioned earlier, in which Kyle, faced with Cartman's gathered followers, articulates what he believes the message of the film should have been, and what the message of the film has actually become. The speech is, again, the moral center of the episode. The speech is the show telling its audience, in as plain a voice as it has ever used, that a religious work cannot control what is done with it, and that a religious work that focuses obsessively on suffering and accusation is likely, regardless of its maker's intent, to produce suffering and accusation in its audience. The third figure in the episode, the cartoon version of Mel Gibson, is the closest thing the episode has to a villain, and the show's portrayal of him is, by the standards of the show's treatment of celebrities, surprisingly restrained. He is presented as a man so absorbed in his own project that he has lost touch with how the project is being received. He is presented as someone whose private behavior around the boys, when they encounter him at his home, is strange enough to be funny, but is not depicted in a way that goes beyond what the character himself has, at various points in public, been on the record as exhibiting. The show is, in some sense, doing in cartoon form what a great many contemporary news articles were doing in their own form, which is to ask whether a filmmaker whose film is producing the kinds of responses the film was producing should themselves be subject to additional scrutiny. The episode does not answer that question. It just asks it in the form of a cartoon man jumping out of windows and demanding to be tortured. The viewer can read what they like into the gestures. Watched now, 20 years after its original broadcast, The Passion of the Jew has aged differently than many of the show's contemporary episodes. The cultural conversation around Mel Gibson has continued in directions that the episode could not have entirely predicted. The cultural conversation around the use of religious imagery in mass political movements has only intensified in the intervening years. The cultural conversation around Christian Zionist responses to films about Christ has shifted considerably. But the episode itself, watched on its own terms, still does what it set out to do. It says that a religious film can carry many possible readings, that the readings it produces in actual viewers are shaped by what the viewers brought with them into the cinema, and that the responsibility for the readings is shared by the maker and the viewer in a way that neither of them is likely to find comfortable. That is a complicated argument to make in 22 minutes. The episode makes it. In the 11th season, the show produced what is, for many viewers, the strangest religious episode it has ever made, the fantastic Easter special. The episode opens with Stan asking his father a perfectly reasonable question about why the celebration of Easter, the holiest day of the Christian year, involves rabbits and chocolate eggs. The question is the kind of question a child might ask any parent, and the parent's inability to answer it is the kind of small embarrassment that any parent might recognize. The episode then takes that small embarrassment and runs with it into one of the most elaborate religious conspiracy narratives the show has ever attempted. Stan, dissatisfied with his father's evasions, begins to investigate, and his investigation eventually leads him to a hidden secret society which has, by the episode's account, been guarding a particular piece of theological knowledge about the actual history of the Easter celebration for nearly 2,000 years. The conspiracy at the center of the episode is a parody of a particular kind of popular religious thriller that was, at the time the episode aired, in significant cultural circulation, in particular the kind of thriller associated with hidden meanings in religious symbols and with shadowy ecclesiastical orders. The episode lifts the visual language of those thrillers wholesale. There are men in robes, there are candlelit corridors, there are paintings with hidden meanings, there are car chases through European cities. The plot turns on a particular interpretation of who exactly St. Peter was, an interpretation that the episode plays for the full theological joke and that pivots on a piece of wordplay between the saint's name and a particular kind of small animal. The episode delivers the joke straight. The audience either follows the wordplay or they do not, but the episode is not going to slow down to explain it. The Pope, at the time the episode aired, becomes one of the characters in the story, and the episode places him in a kind of moral and theological crisis in which he is asked to choose between maintaining a comforting story and revealing what the show's fictional history claims is the actual truth. What is most interesting about the fantastic Easter special is how seriously it takes the act of theological investigation itself. Stan, in the episode, is not just satisfying a child's curiosity. He is undertaking a kind of personal religious inquiry that, in less satirical form, is the same inquiry that has driven a great deal of serious religious thinking across centuries. The episode is, underneath the comic noise, asking whether a religion can survive the revelation of its actual origins, and the answer the episode gives when the revelation finally comes is more ambiguous than the comic surface of the episode would lead the viewer to expect. The episode does not end with the religion collapsing. It does not end with the religion triumphantly vindicated. It ends with a kind of negotiated stalemate in which the truth is known to a small number of people, and the larger religious practice continues in its conventional form, because the larger religious practice provides things to the people who participate in it that the truth by itself cannot. The episode is, in its way, making the same argument that the All About Mormons episode made several seasons earlier. The metaphysical claim and the lived practice can be separated. The lived practice can carry value even when the metaphysical claim does not. The fantastic Easter special also belongs to a small subgenre of South Park episodes about religious holidays, alongside the recurring Christmas episodes and the various occasional episodes that orbit around particular religious calendar events. The show has, across its long run, returned to the Christmas episode form so many times that the Christmas episodes function almost as a parallel series within the larger show. There are Christmas episodes that are almost entirely sweet. There are Christmas episodes that are almost entirely savage. There are Christmas episodes that interrupt the Christmas storyline to make a political point and then return to the Christmas storyline at the end. The recurring framework of these episodes is one of the show's most stable structural features, and it functions as a kind of running negotiation between the secular and the religious meanings of the holiday. The show has, more often than not, sided with the religious meaning. Even in episodes in which the surface comedy is the loudest, the Christmas episodes tend to end with a small, sincere observation about what the season is supposed to mean, and that observation tends to be closer to the religious meaning than to the secular one. The show that has, in other episodes, been one of the most aggressive religious satires on television is also the show that, in its Christmas episodes, has been one of the most reliably sincere defenders of the religious meaning of the holiday it returns to year after year. That contradiction, again, is the show. The show that mocks the institutional church in red-hot Catholic love is the same show that depicts the priest as a sympathetic, ordinary man in the recurring background of the same town. The show that mocks the Mormon founding narrative is the same show that defends the Mormon family at the end of the episode. The show that produced Trapped in the Closet is the same show that built 9 seasons of warmth around Chef before letting him go. The show that produced 200 and 201 is the same show that produced Super Best Friends. The contradictions are not failures of consistency. They are the consistency. The show's actual position, taken as a whole, is that religion is one of the most important things in human life and also one of the most ridiculous, and that any honest treatment of it has to find room for both observations at the same time. The show finds that room, episode after episode, by refusing to settle. In the 10th season, the show produced an episode that did not, at the time, present itself as a religious episode at all. The episode is Manbearpig, and it is built around a parody of a then-recent documentary film about climate change that had been narrated and partly created by a former United States vice president. The film, the documentary, was at the time being publicly discussed in ways that the episode satirizes. The vice president in the episode arrives in South Park to warn the town about a creature that he claims is roaming the wilderness, a creature that is half man and half bear and half pig, and that represents an existential threat to the entire planet. The boys, taken on a tour of the surrounding mountains by the vice president, eventually conclude that the creature is not real and that the vice president, for whatever reason, is using the threat of the creature for purposes that are not really about the creature at all. The episode, in its original form, is one of the show's most pointed satires of public figures who pivot from political life to apocalyptic advocacy. The Manbearpig of the episode is, in its original framing, a fictional construct, a thing the vice president believes in or claims to believe in because he needs an apocalyptic threat to organize his post-political identity around. The episode treats the search for Manbearpig as a kind of religious quest, with the vice president as the prophet, the boys as reluctant disciples, and the eventual cave expedition as a kind of pilgrimage. The episode plays the whole structure for laughs. The closing image of the original episode is one of the show's quietest jokes, in which Manbearpig is shown, for a brief moment on screen, as visibly not real. What makes this episode worth coming back to in a religious context is what the show did to it a dozen years later. In the 22nd season, the show returned to the Manbearpig story in a 2-part episode that essentially reversed the morale of the original. In the later episodes, the creature, the show now admits, was real all along. The boys were wrong to dismiss the warnings. The vice president was right. The town has been ignoring an existential threat for years, and the threat has been gathering, and the cost of the town's denial is being paid in deaths and damages. The 2-parter is one of the most striking pieces of public self-correction any long-running American television show has ever produced. The show is, in essence, apologizing to the audience for the framing of the original episode. The apology is not delivered in interviews or in press releases. It is delivered in story. Watched in sequence, the original Manbearpig episode and the later 2-parter form Between them, a religious arc of unusual coherence. The original episode is the moment of skeptical dismissal of an apocalyptic claim. The later two-parter is the moment of belated conversion to what turns out to have been the truth all along. The arc is, in its larger shape, a kind of theological story about the cost of refusing to believe in something just because the messenger irritates you. The show is, in the later episodes, doing the work that almost no satirist ever does, which is to publicly admit that a previous joke was made at the wrong target, and that the audience that took the joke at the time as license to dismiss the underlying issue has now been left to deal with the consequences. The religious texture of that admission is what gives the two-parter its weight. It is, in some sense, the show's confession. The same later seasons that gave us the Manbearpig two-parter also gave us, in the 20th season, the long-running storyline built around the things the show called member berries. The member berries are a kind of small purple fruit that, when consumed, produce in the consumer a wave of fond memories about specific cultural artifacts from earlier decades. The fruit speaks. It speaks in the voice of a particular kind of pleasant agreement, asking the consumer if they remember a particular old film, or a particular old song, or a particular old slogan, and the consumer responds with a wave of pleasure at the recollection. The member berries are, on the surface of the show, a joke about nostalgia. They are also one of the most pointed religious arguments the show has ever made about a particular kind of secular faith. The argument the show is making in the member berries storyline is that nostalgia, in the cultural moment in which the episodes aired, was functioning in many people's lives as a kind of substitute religion. The member berries are consumed for the same reason that, in earlier centuries, religious objects were touched and kissed and carried. The member berries offer comfort. They offer a sense of belonging to a community of people who share the same memories. They offer a sense that the world used to make a particular kind of sense, and that this sense is recoverable through the right ritual gestures. The show is making the further argument that this kind of secular faith is, in some ways, more dangerous than the kind of organized faith it superficially resembles, because the secular faith of nostalgia is harder to identify as a faith at all. The believers in nostalgia do not call themselves believers, they call themselves people who simply like things. The show, by making the berries into actual physical objects that whisper into the ears of the people who consume them, is forcing the audience to see the practice as a practice. The argument is one of the show's quietly best constructed pieces of religious commentary, and it sits inside a storyline that ran across a season and resurfaced in later episodes. The member berry storyline also intersects, in interesting ways, with the show's longer-running treatment of political religion. The show has been, across its later seasons, increasingly interested in the way that political loyalty in the contemporary moment has come to function in many of the same ways that religious loyalty used to function. People organize their identities around political affiliations. People treat their political opponents as heretics rather than as fellow citizens with different views. People undertake ritual gestures of allegiance to political figures in ways that resemble nothing so much as the gestures of religious devotion. The show, which has always been allergic to the easy political answer, treats this development with a kind of weary recognition. It is not surprised by it. It has been arguing for the entire run of the show that the human appetite for organized allegiance will find an object whether or not the conventional religious objects are available. The political religion of the later seasons is, in this reading, just the most recent instance of the same pattern that the show has been describing all along. Across all of these later episodes, what changes is not the show's underlying argument. What changes is the kind of religion the show is willing to call a religion. In the early seasons, the religions the show recognized as religions were the ones with churches and prayer books and clerics. In the later seasons, the religions the show recognizes as religions include the financial markets and the climate movements and the wave of internet nostalgia and the loyalty structures of political parties. The recognition is, in some ways, the show's most original contribution to religious commentary. The argument is that religion is not the thing in the building with the steeple. Religion is the structure of organized collective belief, and that structure is present in many more places in modern life than the conventional definition of religion would admit. Wherever you find the structure, you find the same vulnerabilities. The structure can comfort and the structure can deceive. The structure can hold communities together and the structure can drive them apart. The structure is morally neutral, What matters is what the structure is pointed at and who is doing the pointing. The show has, in passing, also given us some of the strangest and most memorable depictions of God himself in the history of American animation. God in the show does not look the way most viewers expect him to look. When God finally appears on screen in a small number of episodes scattered across the early and middle seasons, he is depicted as a small physical creature with a number of animal features combined in a single body. He has, in one notable depiction, a hippo's body and a snake's tail, and a feline's face and other features that do not belong to any of the conventional images of God in the Christian tradition. The depiction is, on the surface, a joke. It is also, on closer reading, a kind of theological argument. The episode in which God is most fully depicted has the boys asking him why he chose to take on the appearance he did. And his answer, paraphrased here, is essentially that human beings have always projected the body of God in their own image, and that the actual body of God, if it could be perceived at all, would not look like any of the images human beings have made of it. The depiction is, in that sense, the most theologically careful joke the show has ever made about its own central deity. It is saying that the visual tradition of God is itself a kind of fiction, and that whatever God is, if God is not the bearded figure on the ceiling of any chapel. That episode also contains one of the show's most quietly serious passages of dialogue. The boys, having found themselves in a position to ask God any question, ask him a series of questions of escalating philosophical weight. Why is there suffering? Why is there death? Why are we here? The answers God gives are, like the answers most actual religious traditions give to those questions, partial and unsatisfying. The episode does not pretend to know the answers, it just stages the questions. And the staging of those questions inside a cartoon between fourth grade boys and a creature with the body of a hippopotamus is one of the most disarming things the show has ever done. The audience is being asked to take the questions seriously while being denied the satisfaction of taking the depiction of God seriously. The combination is the show in concentrated form. The show has also, more obliquely, returned again and again to the figure of the recurring Catholic priest of the town, Father Maxey, who across the long run of the show has accumulated an unusual amount of screen time for a side character. Father Maxey is, in some sense, the show's quietest religious project. He is not the central figure of any episode that is not specifically about religion, and he is rarely given a long arc of his own. But he is present in the background of an enormous number of episodes. He blesses weddings, he blesses funerals, he delivers brief sermons at the front of the church, he sits at the side of the room at town meetings, he listens. And in the episodes in which he is given the center of the story, he tends to function as the show's least cynical adult voice. He is one of the few adults in the town who is allowed by the show to be genuinely good at his job, to take his job seriously, and to make the case that the job is worth doing. That portrayal, sustained over decades of the show's run, is one of the most consequential things the show has ever done with religious authority, and almost no commentary about the show's religious satire takes adequate account of it. The same applies in a quieter way to a small number of other recurring religious figures in the town. The rabbi who occasionally appears in episodes involving the Broflovski family is treated with similar care. The visiting religious figures of various other traditions are, more often than not, allowed to speak in their own voices without being mocked for the speaking. The mockery, when it comes, tends to fall on the institutional structures that surround those figures rather than on the figures themselves. The show is, again, sorting belief into the part that helps people and the part that exploits them, and the part that helps people is, more often than not, allowed to remain unmocked, even when the part that exploits them is being savaged. Across the very long run of the show, the religious figure who has accumulated the most screen time of all, of course, is Jesus. He has appeared as the host of his cable show. He has appeared at the boxing match against Satan. He has appeared in the Super Best Friends. He has appeared in the Imaginationland trilogy. He has appeared in the fantastic Easter special. He has appeared in numerous Christmas episodes. He has appeared in occasional later episodes in which he is given a more violent and more morally complex role than he is given in his early appearances. And in every one of those appearances, the show has maintained a basic loyalty to the surface visual conventions of the figure. He has the beard, he has the robe, he has the calm voice. He has not been redesigned, he has not been ironized. The surface of the character is the same surface that Sunday school illustrations have been printing on classroom walls for centuries. The continuity of the surface is one of the show's quietest gestures of respect, and the continuity is, again, almost never remarked on in the larger commentary about the show's religious satire. There is also, scattered across the show's long run, an unusual willingness to depict religious experience as such. Characters in the show have, in various episodes, undergone what the show treats as genuine experiences of the numinous. They have stood in front of statues that they believe to be miraculous and felt something. They have prayed for help and received what they understood to be answers. They have, in moments of grief or fear, reached for the religious language available to them and found that the language carried weight that they did not expect it to carry. The show, in those moments, almost never undercuts the experience with an immediate joke. The joke usually comes earlier or later. The moment itself is allowed to breathe. That choice, sustained across many episodes and many years, is one of the most generous things the show has ever done with religion. And it is one of the things that makes the show's religious satire feel different from most other religious satire that has aired on American television. The show is willing to laugh at religion in almost every scene. It is also willing, in select moments, to be quiet around it, and the quiet around the religion is what makes the laughter at it feel earned. The show has also been willing, across its long run, to use the figure of the religious skeptic as its own kind of comic target. The episodes that have taken on atheism most directly, in particular the Go God Go To parter we examined earlier, have not been kind to the secular alternative to religious belief. The episodes have instead treated organized skepticism as another kind of organized belief with its own clerics and its own scriptures and its own internal schisms. The point is consistent with the show's larger argument. The structure of organized belief is the thing the show is interested in, and the structure is present in atheist organizations as much as it is present in religious organizations. The label on the front door of the building does not change what is happening inside the building. The show, episode after episode, returns to that observation and worries it from different angles. And the cumulative effect of that worrying is to leave the audience with the unsettled sense that they have been organized by their own beliefs in ways they have not adequately examined. Returning for a moment to Kyle and to the show's longer engagement with Judaism, it is worth pausing on a couple of episodes that have not always received the attention they deserve. In an early season, the show aired an episode in which Kyle and his younger brother Ike are sent to a Jewish summer camp called Jubilee. The episode is, on its surface, a normal South Park summer camp episode in which the boys arrive at a remote location, have run-ins with the camp counselors, and eventually face a kind of supernatural threat at the camp's central event. What makes the episode worth looking at in this context is the way it depicts the religious life of the camp. The songs are reasonably accurate to Jewish summer camp tradition. The references to figures of the religious narrative are reasonably accurate. The depiction of the camp's central religious figure, the leader of the larger gathering, is treated with affection rather than with mockery. The episode is, in many ways, the show's most extended portrait of a working Jewish religious community in operation, and the portrait is, on balance, a warm one. The episode does contain its absurd elements. There is, as in every South Park episode, an obscene central plot involving an artistic competition. There is a sequence in which Kenny, who in the early seasons died in almost every episode, dies in a sequence connected to a glue-based art project. The death is treated with the same dark slapstick that the show used in all of its early seasons. But around that comic center, the depiction of the camp itself is unusually careful. The show is not pretending that the camp is anything other than a Jewish camp. The show is not flattening the camp into a generic summer experience that happens to contain a few Jewish references. The show is instead leaning into the specifics of the religious tradition the camp is celebrating and letting the boys participate in those specifics and letting the audience see the participation. The episode is, in a quiet way, one of the show's most generous portraits of any religious community. Around the same period, the show also aired an episode focused on Ike, the small adopted Canadian brother of Kyle, in which his place in a Jewish religious tradition is treated as the central question. The episode is one of the show's wilder set pieces, and it weaves a number of larger storylines around a central religious event. The religious ceremony is depicted in the central scene with the reasonable accuracy that South Park has always brought to its depictions of Jewish religious practice. The episode's plot turns on a question of identity. Ike, who has been raised as a Jewish child, finds himself uncertain about whether the tradition he is being initiated into is actually his religious tradition, or whether it is the religious tradition of the family that adopted him. The question is treated by the show with more seriousness than the surrounding comedy would lead a viewer to expect. The episode is interested in what it means for a religious tradition to be inherited and what it means for a religious tradition to be chosen. And the eventual resolution of the episode allows Ike to make a choice that the show presents as genuine. The choice is depicted with care. The episode does not undercut it. The ceremony, in the end, is treated as a real religious event rather than as a comic prop. That carefulness around Kyle and Ike and around the Broflovski household's Jewish identity is one of the most sustained pieces of religious portraiture the show has ever undertaken. The household is depicted across decades of the show as a working Jewish household. The mother lights candles. The father quotes references that the rest of the boys, who are not Jewish, do not understand. The grandfather, who appears occasionally, brings with him his own set of religious customs. The episodes of the show that take place during Jewish holidays tend to include small, accurate gestures toward the particular practices of the holiday, and those gestures tend to be allowed to remain in the episode without being undercut. The show is, in those small gestures, doing the kind of representational work that very few other animated shows on American network television have ever bothered to do for a Jewish family. The Broflovskis are not generic. They are specifically and recognizably the kind of suburban American Jewish household that very many Jewish viewers of the show have written over the years about recognizing in their own families. This particularity also gives the show's larger anti-Semitic running joke its weight. Cartman's anti-Semitism, which has been one of the most uncomfortable through lines of the show across its entire run, would be lighter if Kyle were a generic placeholder Jewish character. It is heavier because Kyle is a specific character from a specific household with a specific tradition, and because the show has, across decades, made the household real enough for the audience to feel the cost of the attacks on it. The show is not, in this reading, getting away with anything. The show is making the audience pay the full cost of laughing at Cartman by making sure the audience knows exactly what Cartman is laughing at. The Jewish household at the center of Kyle's life is one of the most loaded structural choices the show has ever made, and the cost of that choice has been carried, episode after episode, by the writing of Kyle himself. In addition to its depictions of organized religions, the show has also, in scattered episodes, taken on the figures of the new religious movements of the contemporary moment. There is an episode in the show's later run that takes on a wave of public interest in particular New Age and quasi-religious wellness practices, and the episode treats those practices with the same skeptical eye that the show has applied to the older organized religions. There are episodes that take on the wave of celebrity-associated spiritual movements. There are episodes that take on the public preachers of secular self-help, who are presented in the show as performing essentially the same function for their audiences that traditional religious preachers perform for theirs. The show is, in all of these episodes, applying the same lens. The lens is the lens it has been applying for its entire run, which is to ask what need the practice is serving for the people who participate in it, who is profiting from the participation, and whether the participation is, in the end, helping the lives of the participants or only flattering them. There are also a number of episodes scattered across the show's run that deal with cults of various kinds, and those episodes are some of the strangest in the show's catalog. The show has, more than once, depicted small religious communities cut off from the larger world and operating under the direction of a single charismatic leader. The depictions tend, again, to draw a careful distinction between the followers, who are usually treated as ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, and the leader, who is usually treated as a figure of contempt. The leader is responsible for the structure. The followers are responsible only for having found their way to a place that flattered something in them. The distinction is, again, the show's running argument. Religion is what people do together. The exploitation of religion is what particular individuals do to particular other individuals. The two things are not the same. The show's careful insistence on the distinction is one of the things that makes its religious satire, in retrospect, more humane than the surface noise of the satire would suggest. In the later years of the show's run, the religious episodes have grown rarer in proportion to the show's total output, but they have not disappeared. The show has, in its more recent seasons, turned its attention to a number of newer religious controversies, including the public conversation around clergy abuse in various denominations, the public conversation around new high-profile religious figures, and the public conversation around the relationship between religious institutions and various political movements. The treatment of these subjects in the later seasons has, on balance, been quieter than the treatment of the equivalent subjects in the show's earlier seasons. The show is, in its later years, less interested in producing the loud religious episode that lands as a single, self-contained statement, and more interested in weaving small religious observations into the texture of its more political storylines. The political turn of the show's later seasons has meant that religion now tends to appear inside the political stories, rather than as its own dedicated subject, and the resulting episodes have a different feel from the religious episodes of the show's middle period. The show has also, in its later years, increasingly experimented with the long-form special. The pandemic special, which aired during the global health emergency of the early 2020s, is one of the show's most ambitious long-form pieces, and although it is not, on its surface, a religious episode, it is full of small religious observations. The show depicts a town struggling with the new conditions of life under the pandemic, and the responses of the various townspeople to the new conditions are framed repeatedly in language that the show borrows from religious traditions. There are scenes of public confession. There are scenes of communal lamentation. There are scenes of small individual acts of faith. The show is, in its observation of the town's response to the crisis, drawing on the same vocabulary that it used to describe the town's response to the financial crisis in Margaritaville more than a decade earlier. The vocabulary is the religious one. The crisis, whatever its surface, produces the same shapes of response, and those shapes, again, are religious shapes. Some of the show's later long-form specials have also revisited individual recurring characters in ways that the regular run of the show did not have time to do. There is a sequence in one of the later specials in which the character of Stan, now grown, returns to the town in middle age, and the religious observation around his return is one of the more striking things the show has done in its later years. He looks at the town he left behind, he sees what has remained and what has not. He notices in particular what has happened to the various institutions of the town in the years he has been away, and his observations are framed in a way that has the quiet feeling of a religious self-examination. He is, in the long-form special, doing the kind of small accounting of his life that, in earlier centuries, would have been done in a confession booth or in a quiet conversation with a religious figure. The show is, in those sequences, finally giving its main characters the kind of long internal life that the regular episodes could never afford to give them. And the long internal life turns out, when the show finally affords it, to be a religious life in many of its essential features. The questions are religious questions. The vocabulary is religious vocabulary. The shape of the self-examination is the shape of a confession. It is worth pausing on the way the show has handled the long arc of Kenny across its history. Kenny, the small character in the orange parka, dies in almost every episode of the early seasons. The pattern is so persistent that it functions as a running joke. The other boys notice every episode that Kenny has died, and they observe his death with the same line, delivered week after week in a way that becomes, in its repetition, a kind of grim litany. What is interesting about Kenny in the context of the show's religious history is that the boy does not stay dead. He returns week after week with no acknowledgement of the previous death. The show eventually addresses this directly. It produces episodes in which Kenny himself is shown to be aware of the cycle of his deaths and rebirths, and to be tired of them and to be carrying the weight of being the only person who remembers his previous lives. The religious resonance of that arc is one of the show's most quietly developed jokes. The figure of the person who dies and returns is the central figure of more than one of the world's major religions. The show is, by giving that pattern to Kenny without commentary in the early seasons, and then by allowing Kenny himself to recognize the pattern in the later seasons, doing something with religious figuration that very few other animated shows have attempted. The cycle of death and return is, on the surface, a comic running gag. Underneath, it is one of the most overtly religious structures in the show's catalog. The pattern is given its fullest treatment in one of the show's longer story arcs, in which Kenny is given a costumed alter ego who fights crime in the town, and whose mortality is presented as a complicated theological question. The arc is treated with the show's normal mixture of slapstick and seriousness. There are obscene jokes. There are extended action sequences. There are also, scattered through the arc, moments in which the show pauses to consider what it means to be the kind of person who cannot stay dead, and what kind of burden that condition places on the person who has to bear it. Kenny, in those moments, is given a quiet inner life that the early seasons would never have permitted him to have. He is shown to be tired. He is shown to wonder why he has been singled out for the burden. He is shown to be unable to share the burden with the people around him, because the people around him do not remember the previous deaths. The arc is, in its way, one of the most explicitly religious things the show has ever produced, and it does not advertise itself as religious. It just is religious in the way that any extended story about death and return is going to be religious, whether the writers acknowledge the resonance or not. The show has also returned in its very latest seasons to the figure of Cartman, who has, across the long run of the show, accumulated more religious significance than any other character with the possible exception of Kyle. Cartman has been, at various points, a preacher, a prophet, a cult leader, a heretic, a saint, a sinner, an antichrist figure, and a martyr. He has been, in various episodes, killed by his own followers, resurrected by his own followers, betrayed by his own followers, and venerated by his own followers. The pattern of those episodes, taken together, suggests that the writers have, across decades, been interested in using Cartman as a kind of test case for what a religious figure can do to and for the people around him. The conclusion of those test cases, as far as one can draw a conclusion from a series of comic episodes that do not always speak to each other, is that the people around the religious figure tend to get the religious figure they deserve, and that the religious figure tends to find followers who reflect, in some uncomfortable way, the people the religious figure already is. It is worth, before we approach the close of the night, returning briefly to one of the very earliest religious episodes the show ever made, the small, two-part story that introduces Cartman to the question of whether he and his friends are going to hell. That two-parter, which aired in the 4th season, contains the joke about the Mormons being the only ones who got the religion right, but it also contains a much longer and more careful story about what Cartman tries to do when he is told, by an authority he believes, that his friend Kenny has gone to hell. Cartman's response is, in its way, one of the most genuine things the character has ever done. He decides, briefly, to become a religious leader of his own. He gathers the other children. He tells them what he has been told. He begins to organize them into a community of belief with himself at the head of it. The community he gathers is, on its surface, played for laughs. The children are credulous. The setting is absurd. Cartman is plainly motivated by ambition rather than by any sincere concern for his friend's soul. But underneath the comic noise, the episode is doing something quite specific. It is showing how easily a small, frightened community can be organized around the question of what happens after death, and how easily a leader of that community can begin to make decisions for the community that the community would not have made on its own. The two-parter is also one of the show's earliest sustained depictions of hell as a place. The cast of newly arrived souls that Kenny encounters in hell is depicted in some detail. The administrative figures of hell are introduced, the mechanics by which a soul arrives in hell is processed, and is allocated to a particular fate are laid out with the kind of cheerful, bureaucratic detail that the show would later return to in many of its other hell-focused episodes. The depiction is funny. It is also weirdly specific. The Hell of South Park is depicted with a coherence that suggests that the writers have spent more time thinking about it than the surface jokes would suggest. The various tiers of hell, the various famous residents of hell, the various rules of behavior in hell, all of these are sketched out across the two-parter and then maintained with reasonable consistency in subsequent episodes that return to the location. The cumulative effect is to give the show a stable underworld that the audience can navigate. That stability is, again, one of the things that makes the show's religious satire feel different from most other religious satire. The show has built the place that the satire is set in. The place is not borrowed. It is its own. The same can be said of the show's stable upstairs. Heaven, when it appears in the show, is depicted with a similar coherence. There is a particular visual language for the clouds and the gates. There's a particular set of administrative figures who appear in the episodes set in heaven. There is, in one notable arc, a long sequence in which heaven needs to recruit a basketball team and turns to the residents of hell for help, in a story that puts the residents of both locations in unusual conversation with each other. The ark is one of the show's stranger and more memorable inventions, and it underlines, again, the show's larger position on the afterlife. The afterlife is real in the show. It has rules, it has rosters, it has problems. The residents of the afterlife have lives. The heaven of the show is not abstract, it is a place. The hell of the show is not abstract, it is a place. And the two places between them give the show a stable theological architecture that no other animated American sitcom of comparable length has bothered to build. That architecture is, finally, one of the most important things the show has ever done with religion. Most satirical shows that address religion do so by mocking the particular practices of particular institutions and then returning to a default secular world in which the religious institutions are absent. South Park does not have a default secular world. The show's default world contains heaven and hell and Jesus and Satan and the various recurring religious figures of the town. The show's default world is, in some sense, more religious than the world of the audience watching the show. Because in the show's default world, the existence of the supernatural is not in question. The supernatural is on the screen. The supernatural makes choices. The supernatural has feelings. The supernatural can be visited and consulted and bargained with. And against that default, the various particular religions of the world are not being mocked from a position of secular distance. They are being mocked, if mocked is the word, from a position of immersion. The mocking comes from inside the religious world, not from outside it. That is the deepest argument the show has ever made about religion, and it is the argument that most reliably surprises viewers who come to the show with the expectation that it is going to be an atheist sermon in cartoon form. The show is not an atheist sermon. The show is, in its own strange way, one of the most religious shows in the history of American animation. It is a show in which the supernatural is permanently present, in which the founders of the world's religions are recurring characters, in which the afterlife is mapped, in which the figure of the Christ is allowed to live in a small Colorado town for decades, and to do small, ordinary things in that town, in which the believer is, more often than not, allowed to keep her belief, and in which the skeptic is, more often than not, allowed to keep her skepticism. The show does not want to convert anyone. The show does not want to deconvert anyone. The show wants to look at the structure of organized belief and to laugh in detail at the parts of the structure that have earned the laughter, while leaving the parts that have not earned the laughter alone. That is the project that the show has been working on for more than 2 decades. It is a project that the show has never advertised as a project. The show, in its own marketing and in the public statements of its creators, has tended to describe itself as a show about whatever happens to be in the news that week. The religious project has run underneath the news. It has accumulated, episode by episode, into something that none of the individual episodes can quite represent on its own. Watched as a whole, the religious episodes of South Park form one of the most extensive bodies of religious commentary in American popular culture over the past 2 decades. And that body of commentary is, on balance, less hostile to religion than most viewers would casually assume. The show has, more often than not, been on the side of the believer and against the institution that profits from the believer. The show has, more often than not, been on the side of the practice and against the doctrine that distorts the practice. The show has, more often than not, been on the side of the community and against the leader that exploits the community. Those positions, taken together, add up to a religious sensibility that is more humane than the show is often given credit for. It is also, in its own way, a religious sensibility that has been remarkably consistent across changes in the cultural moment. The show that aired Mr. Hankey the Christmas Pooh in the late 90s is recognizably the same show that aired the long-form pandemic special more than 20 years later. The religious episodes of the show's first season and the religious episodes of the show's most recent seasons are doing essentially the same work. They are using the comic surface of the show to ask whether the religious practices in question are good for the people who practice them, and they are leaving room in the answer for the practices that turn out to be good and the practices that turn out to be bad to be distinguished from each other. The consistency across so much time and so many cultural shifts is one of the show's most impressive achievements. Most long-running shows about religion drift over time toward one or another of the available positions. South Park has not drifted. It has continued to occupy the same odd middle ground for the entirety of its run, and the persistence of that occupation is, in its own way, one of the show's most distinctive contributions to the larger American conversation about belief. The persistence is, in part, a function of the writers themselves. Trey Parker and Matt Stone have, in interviews across the years, returned again and again to the same set of observations about religion. They have described being raised in religious households. They have described the experience of being inside religious communities. They have described their respect for the genuinely religious people they have known. They have also described the experience of becoming uncomfortable with particular institutional practices and with particular leaders and with the way that some religious institutions handle their power. The combination of those experiences, taken together, produces the position the show has occupied for its entire run. It is the position of a person who knows the religion from the inside, who has reasons for the discomfort, who is not interested in pretending the discomfort is not there, and who is also not interested in throwing away everything good about the religion in order to express the discomfort. The position is not a comfortable one. It is the position of the person who has been inside the building and has chosen, in the end, to stand in the doorway, neither in nor out. That doorway position is what gives the religious episodes of the show their particular tone. The episodes are not the work of an outsider throwing rocks at a church. They are also not the work of an insider defending a church against any criticism. They are the work of someone who has been inside the church and who is now standing in the doorway, looking back in and looking out at the same time, and reporting honestly on what they can see from that position. The reporting is, by turns, affectionate and savage and tender and brutal. And the combination of those tones is the tone of the show itself. It is also the tone, more broadly, of a particular kind of American relationship with organized religion that the show has come, over the years, to articulate more clearly than almost any other piece of American popular culture in its period. The relationship is one of inherited belief that has been complicated by personal experience. And the complication is what the show is, episode after episode, trying to find new ways to describe. That description is, finally, what the show offers to a viewer who comes to it looking for something to think about. The show offers, in cartoon form, a sustained portrait of what a thoughtful, complicated relationship with religion looks like. The portrait is not flattering to any particular religion. It is also not unflattering to any particular religion. It is, instead, a portrait of the human relationship with religion as such. A relationship that includes ridicule and reverence and confusion and grief and gratitude and rage and all of the other things that the human relationship with religion has always included. The portrait is delivered in a comic medium that does not, on its surface, seem capable of carrying that much weight. The medium turns out to be capable of carrying more weight than it looks. The show has, episode by episode, proven that the cartoon form can hold an extraordinary amount of religious thinking. And the cumulative effect of all that thinking is something that the cartoon form has rarely been asked to deliver before. If you have stayed with me this long, you have stayed with a body of work that has been, across more than 2 decades, one of the most ambitious projects in American animation. And you have stayed with it through one of its most fertile and most contested subject areas. There is, in the show's catalog, a great deal more to say about religion than we have been able to say tonight. There are episodes we have not touched. There are running jokes we have not cataloged. There are small moments of religious feeling in episodes that are not, on their surface, religious at all. And those small moments accumulate when you look back at the show as a whole into something that is larger than any single episode could ever indicate. The show is, in its religious dimension, much bigger than its individual religious episodes. The dimension runs underneath the whole show, in the way that the foundations of a building run underneath the building. You do not see the foundations from the street. You can feel them when you walk through the rooms, in the way the rooms hold themselves together. That is the deepest thing the show has done with religion. It has built a foundation underneath itself that the audience does not always see, and that the audience does not always need to see. The foundation is religious. The foundation includes the literal presence of heaven and hell, the literal presence of Jesus and Satan, the literal presence of the various recurring religious figures of the town, and the long-running set of theological observations that the show has accumulated across its decades on the air. The foundation is what gives the rest of the show its weight. The political episodes feel as serious as they feel because of the religious foundation underneath them. The social episodes feel as serious as they feel because of the religious foundation underneath them. Even the small comic episodes about minor town events feel as solid as they feel because the show has, underneath them, a fully realized supernatural architecture that the writers can call on whenever the story requires it. That foundation is the show's most important contribution to the conversation about religion in American popular culture. And it is the contribution that is hardest to see because it is, by its nature, underneath everything else. Most viewers come to the show for the surface jokes, and the surface jokes are what the show is most often remembered for in the larger cultural conversation. But the foundation is there, episode after episode, year after year, and the foundation is the thing that has allowed the show to continue producing religious episodes for more than 2 decades without ever quite running out of new things to say. The foundation is also, in its own way, a kind of religious commitment on the part of the show itself. The show has committed to taking religion seriously enough to build a working theological architecture inside its own world, and the commitment, sustained over decades, is one of the most quietly devotional things the show has ever done. So as we come to the close of the night, the picture we are left with is not the picture of a show that hates religion. It is also not the picture of a show that loves religion. It is the picture of a show that has lived with religion for a very long time, in close quarters, and that has come to know religion the way a person comes to know a family member they have argued with for years and still cannot quite imagine their life without. The relationship is intimate. The relationship is complicated. The relationship is, in its way, a kind of marriage. The show is married to the religious questions it cannot put down, and the religious questions are married to the show that keeps returning to them. And the marriage has produced, across more than 2 decades, a body of work that nobody else in American animation has produced, and that nobody else, in the foreseeable future, is likely to produce. The body of work is the marriage is the show. It is also worth noting, before we go, the small, recurring devotional moments that the show drops into episodes that are not, on their surface, religious episodes at all. There are scenes scattered across the show's long run in which one of the boys, in a moment of crisis, prays. The prayers are not always granted. They are not always coherent. They are sometimes openly transactional in the way that the prayers of children often are. But they are prayers, and the show, in the moments in which it stages them, almost never undercuts them with an immediate joke. The prayer is allowed to land. The character is allowed to mean it. And the small space the show makes around the prayer is one of the most consistent gestures of religious respect that the show makes anywhere in its run. It is not advertised. It does not draw attention to itself. It simply happens, episode after episode, in the texture of moments that have nothing else to do with religion. The accumulated weight of those small moments is one of the things that gives the show its strange religious heft. There are also recurring images that the show returns to that are, in their own way, religious in their visual language. The image of one of the boys standing alone on the snow at the edge of the town, looking out at something larger than himself. The image of a character standing at a window late at night, thinking. The image of a small group of figures walking together along a road, not speaking, just walking. These images do not call attention to themselves either. They are part of the visual grammar of the show, and they have been since the very first season. But they are religious images, in the broadest sense of the word religious. They are images of small human beings in front of a large world, and they are placed in the show with the kind of care that suggests the writers and the animators understand exactly what those images are doing. The images are doing what religious images have always done, which is to remind the viewer of the size of the world in proportion to the size of the self, and to invite the viewer to feel for a moment what it is like to be small in front of something large. The show has, in other words, done its religious thinking on every available channel. It has done it in the loud religious episodes that we have been examining tonight. It has done it in the smaller religious moments inside non-religious episodes. It has done it in the recurring characters who carry the religious traditions of the town in their bodies. It has done it in the visual grammar of the show itself. And it has done it, finally, in the long sustained presence of the supernatural inside its own world, in the form of Jesus and Satan and heaven and hell and all of the other figures and locations that the show has built up across its long history. The religious thinking is everywhere in the show. It is not confined to the religious episodes. The religious episodes are just the places where the show talks about the religious thinking out loud. The thinking itself runs through the entire show, in every kind of episode, in every kind of mood, in every kind of season. That is, in the end, the answer to the question that the title of this video set in motion. South Park versus religion is not, when you look at it closely, a story of verses at all. It is a story of with. The show is with religion. The show has been with religion for the entire duration of its run, in the way that two old friends who irritate each other are still, after everything, with each other. The arguments between the show and the religions it has taken on are arguments that only happen between parties that are paying attention to each other. The show pays attention to religion. The religions, at various points, have paid attention to the show. The relationship has been bumpy. The relationship has produced one of the most interesting bodies of religious commentary in modern American popular culture. The relationship has not ended. As long as the show continues to air, the relationship will continue. And as long as the relationship continues, the conversation about religion in the show and about the show's place in the conversation about religion will continue along with it. If you have stayed all the way through to this point, you have stayed through a long walk around one of the largest single subjects the show has ever tackled. The walk has not been comprehensive. There are episodes we have skipped. There are running jokes we have not cataloged. There are entire small religious storylines that, in a longer video, would have deserved their own chapters and that we have had to set aside in the interest of time. The show is enormous. The religious dimension of the show is enormous. No single video can ever quite capture all of it, and this one has not tried to. What this one has tried to do is to walk the spine of the religious work the show has done, to touch the major bones of it, and to leave you with a clearer sense of what the show is doing when it puts a religion on screen, and what the show has done with that mode of attention across decades of its long run. If you enjoyed this walk, you might like the other walks of this kind that this channel has done with other shows and other subjects. The format is the same, the pace is the same, the intention is the same, which is to give you a long, quiet companion for the hours of the night when sleep is slow to arrive. The show that is South Park is, for all of its surface noise, a show that rewards this kind of slow attention. The religious dimension of the show, in particular, rewards this kind of slow attention more than almost any other dimension of it, because the religious dimension is the one that runs underneath everything else, and that requires the long lens to see whole. The long lens is what this kind of video tries to provide. The long lens, finally, is what late-night sleep-adjacent narration is for. It is a form that lets you sit with a body of work over time and let the body of work settle into something larger than any individual episode could provide on its own. So that is the picture, as far as we have been able to draw it tonight. South Park has, across more than 2 decades, been one of the most religiously engaged shows in the history of American animation. It has mocked institutions and respected practices. It has savaged leaders and protected believers. It has built its own working theological architecture inside its own fictional world and used that architecture as the foundation for everything else it does. It has been on the wrong side of various particular controversies and on the right side of various other ones, and the cumulative record of those controversies is messier than any short summary can capture. But the cumulative record is also, on balance, the record of a show that has cared about religion more than almost any other show of comparable scale and reach. And that has expressed its caring in the only way the show knows how to express anything, which is by writing more about it, year after year, season after season, in episode after episode of a comic cartoon that almost nobody, on first viewing, would have predicted was going to turn into one of the great religious conversations of its era. It is a quiet kind of accomplishment, and it is the kind of accomplishment that the show itself, in its public statements about itself, would probably not claim. The show has always preferred to describe itself in smaller terms. It has always preferred to talk about whatever happens to be in the news that particular week. But the larger accomplishment is there, in the foundation underneath the show, in the long accumulated body of religious episodes and religious moments and religious images. The accomplishment is real, even if the show does not advertise it. And the accomplishment is, in the end, a gift to the audience that has stayed with the show across decades. The audience that has stayed has been given, in cartoon form, a long, quiet companion in the ongoing conversation about belief that the modern world cannot quite seem to put down. The companion is funny. The companion is, at times, infuriating. The companion is also, when you stop and look at it, surprisingly serious about the things it claims not to be serious about. That seriousness is the gift. The gift is the show. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe and I'll see you in the next one.